What if the second pocket guide to the Empire was so bat-fuck insane that the Elder Council immediately banned it from ever being published? Like, sure, the Imperial Geographic Society took its initial marching orders from Morihata's commission and then went, fuck it, here's what it's really all about, and wrote the craziest rendition of Tamriel ever, meaning the most truthful rendition of Tamriel ever. Hello, my name is Savley, and welcome to my series Tamrielic Apocrypha, where we dive deep into the various Elder Scrolls lore books. Today we're talking about one of the most insane lore books in the Elder Scrolls series. Honestly, I think this is almost on par with the 36 Lessons of Vivec, which, if you've read those texts, is pretty damn exciting. The text that we're talking about today is fascinating, but it is also borderline incomprehensible in many places, and my job today will be to do my utmost to help you understand as much as I understand it myself. The Pocket Guide to the Empire Volume 2. What's that all about, huh? First, I have to go into a little background, and actually it might be a bit of a longer background on this book before we start talking about its actual contents, but it's really gotta be this way. You did click on a multi-hour video, so I hope you're ready for some really deep, really interesting, really unorthodox Elder Scrolls lore. So, the Pocket Guide. It seems like every time you reinvent the lore of the Elder Scrolls, you have to write a new Pocket Guide to the Empire. For context, there have been several previous pocket guides. In 1998, the first pocket guide came out. It came out with The Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, which was this spin-off game that Bethesda released. And 4 years later, Bethesda released the third game in the series, Morrowind, which also kind of relies on this lore, or rather expands upon it in certain ways. The first pocket guide was written by the developers Michael Kirkbride and Kurt Kuhlman. And it's basically written as a highly biased account of the various provinces of Tamriel from the perspective of an imperial writer. So the book is essentially a list of all the regions of Tamriel, and then systematically it goes through the regions one by one, talking about the history, culture, peoples, and interesting places in each one of the regions. If you've never really studied the lore of the Elder Scrolls series, I think the first pocket guide is an amazing place to start. I have also made an entire 2-hour podcast about that book as well, so if you haven't listened to that or haven't read the book at all, you might want to consider doing that before this episode, because it will give you a sort of fundamental understanding of Tamriel before we completely shatter all your understanding with this particular book that I'm talking about today. So, the first pocket guide was in 1998. Then, 8 years later, when The Elder Scrolls Oblivion came out, Bethesda released the third pocket guide to the Empire. This one was written by Kirkbride and Ted Peterson, and it is written as a more refined, more neutral, more unbiased depiction of Tamriel, with some of the lore changed for Oblivion, because Oblivion kind of retconned some things, and so they felt the need to smooth over some of the rough edges of this retcon. I also hope to cover this book in a future episode of the series. And then in 2014, The Improved Emperor's Guide to Tamriel came out. This was an ESO lore book, which sort of was supposed to give you a greater understanding of that game's lore. As a side note, I don't play The Elder Scrolls Online and I don't care about its lore, so I won't be mentioning it from now on. But the second pocket guide came out in 2012 and 2013, and it is not tied to any particular game release. It is actually not even considered canon by Bethesda, although, there is no such thing as Elder Scrolls canon. That's a subject for another video, but it is very different from the other pocket guides. Each section is written by a different author, and I mean by a different real-life author as well as an in-lore author. And each author has different sensibilities, different ways of covering the topic that they are talking about, as we will see. So some of the sections of the Pocket Guide are basically prosaic descriptions very similar to the other ones, and other sections are so poetic that they are barely comprehensible, as I've said already. It's also worth mentioning that several sections of the Pocket Guide have never been written, so the work as a whole is incomplete, and as we will come to see, it's strangely appropriate to this particular work. So, to begin with, we should talk about the real-life genesis of this monster of a lore book. Who wrote it and why, and what was the overall context? My source for all this information is the Imperial Library, which is just a fabulous source of Elder Scrolls lore, and I will be quoting from them a lot today. The story goes like this. After the release of The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, many fans of the weirder side of Elder Scrolls lore were disappointed. Previously to Oblivion, we had Morrowind, which was this sort of wacky game set in a very unfamiliar setting, emphasizing a lot of religious elements, a lot of metaphysical elements, just the strangest side of Elder Scrolls lore. But Oblivion actually pivoted away from that. It seemed to emphasize a more traditional fantasy, a more high fantasy aesthetic, like something you might see in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, for example. And J.R.R. Tolkien's name is very relevant here because I am not the first person to observe that Oblivion was released a few years after the first Lord of the Rings movie, or just the Lord of the Rings movies in general, and those movies seem to have inspired Bethesda very much. Now, many fans of Morrowind, like myself, are not really happy with this, but I gotta acknowledge that it was probably the right call, because it's definitely possible that by leaning more into the generic side of Elder Scrolls lore, Bethesda have ensured that the franchise would resonate with a wide audience, wider than ever before. But anyway, many fans of the weird lore were disappointed with Oblivion, and this was also a time during which the actual Elder Scrolls developers would hang out in the official Elder Scrolls forums together with the fans. So if you are a fan active in those forums, you had the chance to ask the developers some clarifying lore questions, maybe. You had the chance to interact with them on a level which we can't really do with Bethesda today. Some of the more active developers included people like Michael Kirkbride or Ted Peterson, and these people from time to time tended to post their own new texts about Elder Scrolls lore. These texts, which were written only for the forum, they were not intended to appear in any game, were more mystical, more esoteric. They basically harkened back to the Morrowind era lore and ignored sort of the Oblivion aesthetic. And these texts altogether were dubbed Monkey Truth, which is an actual term from the texts of Michael Kirkbride. It's apparently a heretical society featured in his roleplays and writings. So, we have this community of fans and developers who miss the old lore, and suddenly an idea comes up. Why not write a new Pocket Guide to the Empire collectively? The third Pocket Guide to the Empire, which was released with Oblivion, actually referenced the second Pocket Guide, which would obviously have had to come out between the first and third, but Bethesda had never written that book. So the idea was, why don't we write that book ourselves? It will be set in a time before the third Pocket Guide, so we can sort of ignore the high fantasy aesthetic of Oblivion and maybe make it a bit weirder. The main person who sort of took charge of this project and wrote the initial outline was Michael Kirkbride, and here I have to talk a bit about him. Kirkbride is often credited as the main driving force between the weirdest elements of Morrowind. He is the author of the 36 Lessons of Vivek, as well as just a ton of other esoteric, weird, metaphysical, mystical, just batshit insane lore. He also seems to have a very loose sense of what is canon. From his posts and comments, I think that I can safely say that his position is basically that if two pieces of lore contradict each other, it's not a problem. Contradictions are not a problem as long as all the lore is just cool enough, as long as all the lore is interesting and worthy of being in the Elder Scrolls lore. So he's very much a type of person to encourage the fans to come up with their own, not just theories, but their own actual lore. And this fact explains how the project that we are about to read was organized. Now, let's take a look at his initial project outline and his pitch for the project, starting with what was said about the text in the third Pocket Guide. Quote, "At last, recognizing the original's multitudinous anachronisms, a second edition of the guide was commissioned in the 331st year of the Empire by the Empress Morehatha. The Imperial Geographic Society was once again called upon to update its descriptions, remove most of the propagandistic tone of the original, and to reiterate and modernize the claim that Tamriel was in fact a unified empire." End quote. When coming up with the actual idea for the PGE2 project, Kirkbride takes into account the fact that while the existence of the second guide has been confirmed, the same is not true for its release. He then proceeds to give the quote that I started the video with, the one about the Elder Scrolls lore being completely batshit insane in this particular lore book. So yeah, the idea here is the Empress commissioned a new pocket guide, but it turned out so heretical that it was immediately banned and all the authors of the guide were executed. Well, not all of them except for those who escaped, went into hiding, only to later reform themselves as Temple Zero. So the second guide would be set in the year 331 of the Third Era, about 11 years into Empress Morihatha's reign, and over 100 years before the third pocket guide. It was not meant as a rejection of the new lore established in Oblivion. Kirkbride also wrote a lot of the new lore for Oblivion, but this pocket guide was supposed to shift the focus to some of the more weirder, more esoteric elements. Now, Kirkbride was joined in this project by the Temple Zero Society. As we heard in the quote, Temple Zero are the heretical scholars who managed to escape Morihatha's regime, but it's also a name for a real-life group of Elder Scrolls lore fans. There seem to be a lot of these groups and terms that have meaning both in the lore and in real life for Elder Scrolls lore buffs. And so these fans, together with Michael Kirkbride, spent the next few months bouncing ideas around, outlining their sections and writing. So, just to clarify, yes, the entire second pocket guide to the Empire was written by Michael Kirkbride and a bunch of really hardcore fans. It was supposed to include sections about all the classic provinces of Tamriel, Skyrim, Cyrodiil, Argonia, but also a couple of new ones. For example, Kirkbride's outline mentions the, quote, heretofore secret provinces of X and Y. The latter, of course, exists on the moons of Masser and Secunda. What? End quote. He also wanted the second pocket guide to expand even more on the cosmology of the series, not limiting itself to just Tamriel itself. So, one of the earliest sections would be called the Wheel Metamundic and includes, quote, serpents and the rumors of serpents, a description of the Orbis, Aetherius, Oblivion, Mundus, Nirn, and Tamriel, chock full of new shit and inherent contradictions. It runs as many pages as we think the reader might not headsplode. End quote. Yes, this is how Kirkbride actually writes. As for the actual collaboration process, the Imperial Library describes it in this way, quote, while it is hard to convey in summaries like this one, it cannot be understated just how collaborative the project was. While Temple Zero Society was invite-only, many people joined specifically for the pocket guide and were encouraged to submit ideas, art, and writing. Everyone knew that their submissions would be critiqued and edited. Everyone was welcome to disagree with everyone else. There was plenty of yes ands, as well as no's, in both the brainstorming and writing stages, members editing each other's texts, and different chapters and ideas feeding off each other. The second pocket guide was not just a text to be written, it was an enclave of like-minded creatives seeking to find a world rather than merely to describe it. End quote. Now, as I said, unfortunately the book was never finished. The efforts simply fizzled out over time. There were a couple of missed deadlines, the time started to drag on, and while some of these sections turned out complete, others had no work done on them, virtually no work. But interestingly enough, this is very on brand for the actual text in lore, Because if you think about it, okay, like the authors of the second pocket guide are supposed to have mysteriously disappeared, They were either killed by the Empire or they just managed to run away. Kind of like the real-life authors, real-life members of the Temple Zero Society, who also in many cases disappeared off the forums, never to be heard from again. The text is incomplete and fragmented, which also makes sense because in lore it is supposed to be suppressed by the Empire. It is also considered heresy by the Empire, which is kind of similar to how it might be considered by Bethesda, Bethesda doesn't consider this canon, obviously, so it is kind of heretical. I don't know, I find it really cool how the real-life status of this project basically mirrors what it's supposed to be in lore. Well, as for the reception of the text by the fans of the Elder Scrolls lore, the Imperial Library tells us this, quote, the strange collection of text was published in a semi-roleplay fashion and became an instant classic, a capstone to the golden years of the Elder Scrolls lore forum. Its fragmented nature and the departure of most of its original crew years previously added to its mystery, as did the difficulty of finding it in the first place, giving the writings the same secretive, exclusive feeling that the in-universe pamphlet was supposed to evoke. Parts of it heresy bled into the collective psyche, where mistaken for orthodoxy became the building blocks of new ideas, both official and fan-made. End quote. So yes, to summarize, the second pocket guide was never finished and some of the sections are very bare bones, but what is there is cool as hell, so let's talk about it. Introduction. Well, now that we've gotten through all the meta info about the book, it's time to dive into the first chapter. But the first chapter is titled Introduction, so we are still kind of in the introduction phase. This chapter was first posted by Michael Kirkbride on the 1st of January 2012, and it was not only written by him, it was also co-written with two community members, Adenorsil and Adventurous Putty. Before I actually dive into the introduction, I'll give you a brief summary of what happens, just in case you want to skip ahead to some of the later chapters which are focused on the provinces, because, let's face it, that's what you're here for. But the introduction is written in a pretty interesting way, so I would recommend you stay here for that too. It essentially depicts the trial at which the authors of the Pocket Guide were sentenced to death. That's what this introduction is. The chapter itself begins with the editor's note, which will explain to us what this even is, and I found this editor's note very useful. It essentially explains what I started with in much greater detail. So, we learn that the chapter itself is a transcription of a note folded inside a manuscript of the second Pocket Guide. A manuscript commissioned by Morrowind but unpublished because it was deemed too scandalous. The scholars working on it simply took their assignment too literally. This manuscript itself was discovered by a spy of Temple Zero, which is the faction formed by those who managed to escape Morrowind's wrath. So they sent their spy who discovered this manuscript somewhere in a forbidden library of the Moth Chantry, but unfortunately the contact with the spy has been lost. But what is even a Moth Chantry? It must obviously be related to the cult of the Ancestor Moth, which is a pretty well-established concept of Cyrodiil lore. We also talked about it in the first Pocket Guide. There was this extremely interesting section about the monks of this order who constantly chant to attract the moth to them, and it basically almost looks like they are clothed in hundreds, thousands of these moths, and as soon as they stop internally chanting and do something else, such as actually speak, the moth flies off, only to come back once they resume their chanting again. So, back to the manuscript. Unfortunately, Temple Zero has been having trouble deciphering it. The editor tells us that, quote, in passages, it can be difficult to distinguish the original text from the sender's hectic fever dreams. It is the work of the Empire's sleepers, no doubt, their touch venomous, their tendrils crawling through every pocket of the dream sleeve. End quote. Yes, so here we are communicating by dream sleeve, which is actually a pretty popular concept in Elder Scrolls lore, and it is canon, but it is seldom mentioned in the actual games, I think. My understanding is that it's basically a way to communicate telepathically through dreams. This is a gross simplification of it, but that's basically what it does, and it's used predominantly by the Empire. It's used by the Emperor's agents and clerks to communicate at distance. The chapter itself also reveals a bit about how the dream sleeve actually works. Maybe. So, the manuscript are the minutes of a secret meeting of the Elder Council, and this is the meeting at which the writers of the second Pocket Guide were sentenced to death and the text itself suppressed. The editor's note concludes with the editor, who is obviously a member of Temple Zero, crying against the oppression of the Empire. And now we're finally getting to the manuscript itself. It starts with a string of letters and numbers, as if we were accessing a secret database. There are things such as ECMBMRA, mnemonic, Daedron capacitance, memos for classification, followed by a string of numbers and letters. Or Cogito code, a gnarled Tibrol tree against the sunset overlooking a lake. Try to feel melancholy. So yeah, this obviously refers to how the dream sleeve works by attuning yourself to certain emotions, certain certain cognitive concepts almost, and specifically the Tibral tree is an interesting find here because this is presumably a species of tree found in the first sermon of Vivek. We don't actually know what the Tibral tree is, but Kirkbride sometimes likes to mention it in his texts in ways which are as cryptic as this one. After the strings of letters and numbers, there is a long list of honorifics of the individual counselors present at the meeting, and some of the names of those counselors are so absurd it's hilarious. Listen to this one, quote, Elder Counselor Maganifly Goodone, Elder Counselor Ambassador Woodworth, and Elder Counselor Delphine IV, along with our ceremonial guard here now named and or title Afternoon Nap, and an adjunct to Elder Counselor Ambassador Woodworth here now named and or titled for this time being Circumference Comfort, now may proceed to assist Elder Counselor Trails His Graves in re-establishing a stable link. Make it happen, people. Ah, very good. Unfortunately, we must laugh now, and in a great volume. Do it! As adjunct Circumference Comfort has received injuries amounting to a minor concussion and third-degree burns along his thigh and needs to be escorted out of the council chambers. Goodbye with you, good sir. End quote. Yeah, that's just how Kirkbride likes to write. The councillors then agree to the actual meeting. The trial is presided by High Chancellor Arboretumest Best Ud Manifas Segu, which I don't know if that name has any meaning. The only one I can think about is Arboretum, which is a section of the Imperial City, right? But as soon as the trial begins, the editor of the IGS, who is sort of trying to defend their actions in writing the pocket guide, can barely get out 5 words before all the writers are pronounced guilty and immediately sentenced to death. So much for the justice of the Empire, I guess. One of the counselors is then concerned because they forgot to encode the meeting, and mid-sentence she is suddenly killed by, quote, Ghost Council Coar, end quote, whatever that is, after which the meeting resumes. And the passage itself concludes with this quote, High Chancellor Arboretumest Best Ud Manifast Segu, hold the center! I have just been informed that Her Majesty has arrived in our heads. There we go! Ponder her! Now, where were we? End quote. Yeah, that's the end of the introduction. If you think this is absurd, I have no idea what's happening, like what? Yeah, I agree with you. The sheer absurdity of this text cannot be communicated over audio. And even if I were to read all of the text word for word, I think there is just there is too much wordplay that would be misunderstood in spoken form. So if you really want to see what this actually is like, you gotta read this actual section by yourself. I think that after that brief overview, you are more equipped to do that and understand it better than I did when I first read it. Which still means that you won't understand a lot of this. So keep listening for the next section. The Wheel Metamundic. The next section was supposed to be called the Wheel Metamundic, but unfortunately it wasn't really written. All that we have is the proposal, written by Adonorsil. This whole section was intended to cover the overall nature of the mortal realm, so it was supposed to be this kind of high-level overview, kind of similar to the intros to the first and third pocket guide. It was supposed to be split into 3 different sections. The first section is titled Watching Us, the Spokes of Heaven, and is described this way. Elaborate on how spokes both support the hub, but also keep it in place should it want to move around. Describe impossible dimensions and locations. Cast the god planets in the role of both custodians and guards. End quote. The spokes of the wheel are also mentioned in the sermons of Vivek, mainly in Sermon 21, where they are described as the 8 components of chaos as yet solidified by the law of time, and also as the lent bones of the Aedra, the 8 gift limbs to Sithisit, outside them is Orbis and not within. So yeah, this first section was supposed to be a high cosmology level overview. The second one is titled Beholding Us, the Spheres of Misrule. Quote, where they fit in and what they find so fascinating about the mortal world. Why, even in terms of infinity, they are much bigger than the god planets. End quote. I think that one is pretty self-explanatory, talking about the heavenly spheres. And the third section is titled Looking for Us, the Empyrean Beyond. Quote, of the stars, where they are, what shapes they take, constellations, how the god planets are insignificantly small compared to them. Perhaps a small reference to a SETI-like project. A star once said hello, but it was hushed up. End quote. I gotta admit, I had to look up what SETI, or well, SETI, actually stands for. It stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. So there you go, if you didn't know that. Now, everyone approved of this proposal, of this section, but unfortunately it was simply never written, so we will move on to the next one. Kalpa Akaishicorprus. What does that title even mean? Well, we know what kalpas are, and we will talk about that, but there is also corpus, and there is Akashi, which sounds like a reference to Akatosh, the god of time. Anyway, this section is unfortunately another incomplete one, but we do have a bit more than from the previous one. It was essentially intended to mirror the historical overview chapters of the other pocket guides, so it would have talked about the history of the world since its creation. A few drafts of this chapter were actually written, but ultimately they were disregarded because they just seemed too similar to what had been written for the previous pocket guides, and as we've established at the beginning, and as you can probably tell by now, the authors of the second pocket guide wanted to be really, really different from anything that had been written before. The history of Tamriel from its creation was supposed to be intertwined with Kalpa, which we should talk about more. A Kalpa is basically a cycle of life, death, and rebirth of the world. They are these sort of weird, out-of-time eras, periods. Neither word really describes them well because, they are out of time. But the current Kalpa begins with the Merethic era, which is known as one of the earliest eras of Tamriel, right? Kalpas are also related to the concept of dragon breaks, which are these interruptions of flow of time, where time temporarily becomes non-linear and chaotic, and it is essentially a fancy way of explaining retcons and changes to continuity. But in Elder Scrolls lore, they are just these crazy interruptions of flow of time, and we will talk more about them in some of these sections, especially in the section on High Rock. Now, Kirkbride had a really interesting idea for this section. He essentially writes that kalpas are caused by three people trying to catch each other. So these are like three archetypes, although he doesn't really use this word. And these archetypes are king, rebel, and lover, plus also potential witnesses, or a witness, which sees this apocalypse happen. Let me just quote straight from Kirkbride. Quote, "To me, Tamriel kalpas are extinction events caused by three people trying to catch one another, king, rebel, lover, and a witness that sees the resulting eschaton." That's just another word for apocalypse. These roles are always somehow reenacted in a holographic fractal, until snap, the three do catch one another and things explode and another kalpa begins. Because of the holographic nature of the process, the witness is always scattered into several, some of which actually jump kalpas. And then they start their full talking, which wakes up the new king, rebel, lover. This is Mankar's talk about the fall of League. Part last kalpa, part this kalpa, but something a hologram of the witness saw. This is all the other manifestations of an entheomorph. End quote. Okay, definitely lots of concepts to explain there. So, as I interjected at one point, eschaton is another word for apocalypse, so kalpas are essentially extinction events, in case I haven't made that clear enough. League is this reference to the Mythic Dawn commentaries from Oblivion, commentaries written in lore by Mankar Camoran. In real life, they were written by Kirkbride himself, and League is supposed to be this sea region ruled by warring Dreg kings, kings of the Dreg. Allegedly also the birthplace of Mehrunes Dagon. Again, I'm heavily simplifying this. But League is not really a place. It is more of a parallel version of Tamriel, ? It's implied that it is a parallel version of Tamriel, I would say, but it's kind of unclear. And also, this just goes for the entire podcast. There are so many weird concepts here that at any point feel free to write a comment telling me that I'm so wrong about something, because I probably am. There are a lot of weird things to talk about here. And yeah, the last word of the word was enantiomorph, which is basically the fifth walking way from the lessons, right? There are the 6 walking ways to become a god in Tamriel, according to Vivek. And the enantiomorph is the fifth one. It's essentially a state where the king and rebel are metaphysically merged, so one of them has to kill the other to win. A specific example of this would be Vivek and Mephala, at least according to Vivek. He says he basically won his enantiomorph against Mephala, which also ties into the fact that Mephala is an anticipation of Vivek in the tribunal religion, and so on. You know, I'm just now realizing that I think I'm going over these concepts way too fast, but this podcast will be long enough as it is. So if you would like to see a more detailed breakdown of any of these things, let me know in the comments. So to sum up Kirkbride's proposal for this chapter, the lost Kalpa is somehow remembered this time around. It's remembered that the king caught the rebel with the lover, causing the extinction event which happened in front of witnesses. Now, as Kirkbride writes this proposal, all of these titles, you know, the king, the rebel, the witnesses, all of these are followed by question marks. And he's not telling us who these people were and who these events were. We are basically supposed to, or we can, think about who this could possibly fit to, you know, which historical figures could be seen as playing these roles. So the previous Kalpa is somehow remembered, and in the current Kalpa, the king or the rebel is trying to break the rules, specifically by freezing time and space to get the lover with the explosion. Quote, he is trying not to be seen with the lover, trying to consummate it, which will do what, in parentheses. He has made several attempts at killing or erasing potential witnesses so that he can get that freak on. But he's stuck in this process, immortal within its masks, and doomed to live with this one last chance forever, hence corpus. End quote. Meanwhile, the next Kalpa, the one after the current one, will be either an echo of another extinction event or the birth of Amaranth, which is just another term for the walking ways. Kirkbride tells us that there are forces tired of waiting, trying to bring about the explosion. Quote, other forces are fighting those to make sure Amaranth happens, at the beautiful sacrifice of their own lives, since the Amaranth is the new universe that will have no witness but itself and its parents, who will be forgotten as relics of the last of the old kings of Kalpas. End quote. So essentially, the vast majority of this section was supposed to be all about Kalpas and high-level metaphysical concepts as this, and the actual history of Tamriel, going from the first to the third era, would have been relegated to a single paragraph. Concluding his proposal, Kirkbride writes, quote, and yeah, each era should have some wacko that ain't right angle to it. The second era being all snakes with Riemann, just another snake, but with a dude's head, for example, and intoned in the same matter-of-fact style as the rest of it. End quote. I don't know about you, but I think this chapter would have been an amazing and utterly confusing read. Shame we never got it. The Totemic Return, Skyrim. So this is the first chapter of the book, which was actually written in full as intended. It was published, the first section of this was published on the 4th of February in 2011, and the preamble was published on the 1st of January 2012. So yes, there are basically two sections to this. The author of the chapter is Michael Kirkbride, so you know this is gonna be a weird one. In his initial pitch for this chapter, he described this section as, quote, the height of when one of the IGS goes too far, end quote. The chapter was supposed to start with a Nordic view on the origins of Skyrim, mentioning some events like the sack of Sarthal or the retreat to Old Atmora, and was supposed to end with Ysgramor's return. And what follows then? Listen to this. Quote, then begins the phone book of 500. Each and every one of Ysgramor's 500 companions is listed with a deed or effed up moniker. All of them. All 500 of them. The IGS writer is so intent on providing a comprehensive history of Skyrim that this actually sounds like good journalism to him. After the phone book of 500, there's a knock at the door. The blades are here. End. With this in mind, the Skyrim section will look nothing like any of the rest of the PGE2 entries. End quote. And yes, it looks nothing like the rest of the chapters, or indeed nothing like the Skyrim chapter of PGE 1 or 3. This was definitely a very successful attempt at writing something completely different and just completely nuts. Yes, the heart of this is just a gigantic list of names. Now, I haven't counted to see if there are 500 or how many there actually are. I saw somewhere on Reddit that there might even be way more than 500, something like 600, 600 something. I don't know. I haven't counted, okay? I have too much of a life for that. But these names are quite interesting because obviously there aren't 500 historically important figures of the province of Skyrim that we know about. So a lot of these names are made up, and some are made up to be just funny, to be just ridiculous, while others are references, and in many cases pretty subtle references to actual, established figures, established in the lore previously to this chapter. Now, these 500 names listed in the chapter are not supposed to be the actual 500 companions. In fact, the whole point of the chapter is to sort of summarize the entire history of Skyrim, not just the era of Ysgramor, in these 500 names. The placement of many names in this chapter, in this Song of the Return, actually makes no sense. The idea here is that the Nords don't actually care about history, and they don't care about time. All they care about is telling a good story, so they love embellishing the story, and they just keep adding to it, Anytime a new notable figure appears in Skyrim, they just remove one of the previous names, and they add this name to the list. So anyone who's ever been a part of their history is on the list, and a lot of people we've never heard of. Okay, that was the essential knowledge of the meta of this chapter. Now let's get to the actual text. The author opens by explaining that this will make no sense to Cyrodiilic readers, saying, quote, "The Northlanders and their environs are the most variegated simplicity on this earth, with their heroic narratives serving as a record of all events leading to the present day. Which is a long way of saying that the land and the legendary of Skyrim is of a cycle not quite recognizable as prudent to the rest of the Empire's mannish kingdoms, since the Cyrodiilic South prefers some coherence in their fatherland's fancy, and it will give them none." End quote. The text then explains that the Nordic myths are just weird. They borrow elements from other cultures, they use a lot of anachronisms, they are constantly embellished by millennia of oral tradition, as I said, and they often repeat or contradict one another. They like to blend their legends together to serve a good story at feast time. And yes, I think I called this the Song of the Return already, because this is the actual song supposedly sung during the tradition of the Feast of the Dead, which happens every 13th of Sun's Dawn in Windhelm. If you've read the first pocket guide, you will know that it tells us about this tradition when the names of all the companions are recited at this feast. And this version of the song that we have here will tell us everything we must know about Skyrim's people, history, geography, etc. As we go through the text, I will quote extensively from this chapter. I think it is quite appropriate for this one, and maybe try to spot these historical references before I point them out to you, which I will as far as I'm able, but I definitely must have missed some because there are just so many. The Song of Return itself opens with these words, quote, "The first of Ysgramor's 500 mighty companions was actually two, the ashen amalgamation of his sons that had survived Sarthal only to die in the freeze rains of the Returning, named Tsunaltir and Stunalmir when alive, and now called the Gritprince Stunal, whose steer-wives were Ramali, Jarlial, Alyr, and Tuskwidow who forswore her name." I'm gonna end the quote here, but that's just the first half of the first sentence, just so you know what we're in for, okay? So this obviously already refers to Ysgramor, the mythical hero, the first Atmoran Nord who sailed to Tamriel and then brought his 500 companions over to take revenge on the elves that annihilated the city of Sarthal, the first city of men which was razed to the ground by their elven enemies. The two ashen amalgamations of his sons that are referred to here are obviously Tsun and Stun, the Nordic gods. Now, some of the names listed in this giant phone book, as Kirkbride calls it, are simply listed without any info about who they were, while others are given certain attributes or just interesting details from their life. For example, Memiet Chemua, who held secret shield songs unneeded yet. This is, of course, a reference to Chemua, who is one of the 4 monsters that Vivek has to fight in Sermon 9 of the 36 Lessons of Vivek. Let me quote from the sermon, quote, "Chemua, the running hunger, who appeared as a mounted soldier with full helm, had the powers of heart roaring and of sky sickening. He ate the Chimeri hero Dres Kizumet A, sending the spirit back to the Hortator as an assassin. Sometimes called First Blighter, Chemua could give Cloud stomach aches and turn the reign of Veloth into bile. He destroyed 6 Chimeri villagers before he was slain by Vivek and the Hortator. End quote. So obviously these are the wars between the humans and the elves, so it makes sense that Chemua is depicted in Vivek's sermons as an antagonist, as a negative figure, while here he is listed among the companions in the Song of the Return. I think I mentioned that not all the names are serious. In fact, many of them are supposed to be comical. And even in this first paragraph, we see the recurring joke of family titles. Titles like Hearthwives, Kine Wives, Shield Wives, Bookwives, Cake Uncles, and just various sorts of wives and other family members that are hard to wrap our heads around. There are many of those wives listed among the companions. So it sort of begs the question, are they considered companions? Are they just listed because they are wives of companions? And I think the answer is different depending on the specific figures. Let me also give you just some of my favorite names. This one, there were also his 10 totem uncles whose names are too long for ink, but are these in Swift. Aldugapat tujenemen helfel yariga gugure mora. Grojar hisimireke tram. Okay, I butchered those names because they are just stupidly long, okay? Now, on the surface, these names are just supposed to be funny because they are so long and unpronounceable, but the UESP actually hyperlinks to some different gods, so we see that different syllables in their names refer to some deities. For example, the ending syllable of the first name or the ending part of the first name spells Mora, which could be a reference to Hermamora, right? But I don't think it's worth reading too much into this. You can definitely look for a lot of references there. By the way, the hyperlinks on the UESP are just the best way to read this text so that you understand a reasonable amount of the references. Do not read this text in the Imperial Library. I definitely recommend doing so on the UESP where the names are hyperlinked. Okay, another fun passage. Hegum the Deaf and Björl Danaur's son who heard enough to let Hegum know later. Then there is Bjorgamor, the Definitely a Leopard, and Grenfell the Wickerwat, a creature no one could identify but was counted among the mighty. Okay, these are just a few names to illustrate what this text is like. At this point, it's pretty obvious that anyone can be considered a companion, so not only wives are listed among the companions, but also just various creatures, even pets. For example, quote, Kalte, the lynx or leopard, this one was more his pet than Torgbearer, but Isgramor was gregarious and warm, end quote. And also, as we read at the end of the first paragraph, quote, of Isgramor's immediate family, there were these among the 500, but he counted among their number and of that of his own hearth his belt, Isgramor's belt, end quote. So yeah, Isgramor's belt is a companion, I guess. Now, I went a little in-depth on this first paragraph just to give you an idea of what this text is like, but going forward, we will only stick to the most relevant parts. So, the second paragraph mentions the burning of King Olaf in a pretty hilarious way. Listen to this. Quote, by tradition, the both thanes were allowed to race for the vanguard of their high king, and Morgan the Red and his longboat Drumbeater took the foremost before crashing into the hazards of the Broken Cape in First Era 68, no souls aboard surviving, except for Olaf the Dog, a berserker who had been to Hasarig's Head 1,000 times or more and knew leaping magic. He jumped from the wreckage all the way to Skyrim, landing on Olaf's Bridge. He was burned there for his cheating by the students of Hafengar, which now happens every year. Okay, that's a pretty funny way to explain the burning of King Olaf, this, inexplicable ritual that nobody quite knows what it means or why it's going on, but it has been going on for hundreds or even thousands of years. Listed among the companions, we also find Merry Eyesore the Elk, which is Michael Kirkbride's own alias that he uses sometimes. And some new figures that I would honestly love to hear more about. For example, Gelhelm the Outcast, who once married a snowdrake as if no one would notice. That sounds like an entire story of its own. Or Yalyar, who ate a whole bear out of haste because he needed to keep his picnic courtship of Kvalta Lake's daughter going, and she was here with him still, but unwed until her tutelage under Chemua was complete. So yeah, some names are literally just names, while others could have been an entire lore book on its own. The next really important reference is to Thane Rage the Gifted, who is of course spoken about at length in the first pocket guide because he founded the first Empire of Men and grew it to parts of Morrowind, Nibene, and High Rock. His conquest was so successful mostly because of his skilled Thume, which is probably why he's called Thane in this text. The figures listed here as his family are just frankly epic. For example, Olaj Olo, which might be a reference to Bendu Olo, the king of Anvil who united the entire Tamriel against the Slode, or Five-Headed Ismalos, which sounds like a name created by combining Ismir and Talos. Then there is, quote, Thumsha, the queen of the tongues of men, whose lineage was without end in a language of silent letters and bog gods that still hide in the moss beneath the previous Kalpa, and who wore a fake beard everywhere, save for bed. End quote. Wow, what an amazing figure. Then there is Bhag, the Great Debater, which is another of the monsters listed in Sermon 9. Let me just quote from Sermon 9 because I love quoting from the sermons. Quote, Bhag, the two-tongued, who appeared as a great bearded king, had the powers of surety and form change. His raiders were small in number, but ran amok in the west hinterlands, killing many Velothi trappers and scouts. He fell in a great debate with Vivek, for the warrior poet alone could understand the northern man's two-layered speech, though Almsivi had to remain invisible during the argument. End quote. Okay, so that's Bhag, the Great Debater. Then there is Harold Harrybreeks, who never looked on rage directly for fear of foxes. If you know anything about the history of Skyrim, Harold Harrybreeks is supposedly another name for the legendary Pelinal, who fought for Queen Alessia in the First Era. And here he's just casually mentioned as an afterthought, and you will find that that is the case in a lot of this chapter. Then there is Baruch of Baruch, which sounds kind of like Maruk, right? The Imga prophet of the Alessian order. Another person listed is simply Hjalmar, which is what the High King of Skyrim, 14th of Isgramor's line, was called. And then, again on the funnier side, there is the 18-eared Marix, who listens to all the shouts that predate our dawn, and the text then goes on to name all of his 18 different ears. Yes, it gives names to his ears. One of the subsequent paragraphs names Potamaic the Wolf King, whose daughter would be of less height than her father, but no less in stature, coming to her own in the nearing solitude. Now this is of course a reference to the Wolf Queen Potema of Solitude. Another interesting passage, quote, with his brother in Karstad gone, Helmbolg took his leave, as well coughing out the lamps as he did so, for he was beyond anger now and into madness. And Jörg the Calm had to swallow its storms, lest even the sun went out in the shouting. The issue of Borgassa, Borgas ill-omened, the Broken-born, then called for a reformation of the pact, and many of the both Thanes came to his side. End quote. Now this is yet again a highly confusing way to summarize a pretty big part of the Skyrim chapter of the first pocket guide, which talks about Jürgen Windcaller, the legendary pacifist tongue, and King Borgas, who was murdered by the Bosmeri Wild Hunt, and after his death a moot was called to determine his succession, which failed, sparking the War of Succession, which was this 50-year civil war of Skyrim. In the same paragraph we also get a mention of another monster from Sermon 9, the Myrkiller. Listen to how the sermon describes this badass. Quote, Hoaga, the mouth of mud who appeared as a great bearded king, had the powers of marshalling and breathing the earth. On the battlefields, this demon would often be seen on the sidelines, eating the soil voraciously. When his men fell, Hoaga would fill their bodies back with it, whereupon they would rise again and fight, albeit slower. He had a secret name, Fenya, and destroyed 17 Chimeri villages and 2 Dwemery strongholds before being turned away. End quote. Man, Sermon 9 is so cool. I love all the different monsters there. That's why I'm quoting from it, okay? And this whole epic paragraph of the song, which is paragraph 10 out of 13, so we've only got 3 to go, ends with this quote. The last to die was Borgas himself, written in Viscera across the ice by the power shouts of the Lord of the Wolf's heart, and no one gave pity when the monsters of the Change Winds arrived to claim their bond on the soul of the son of Borgassa. Pyres in tribute delayed the return for another month, but the smoke of the kinstrife had sealed the pact again, if only for now in shame. End quote. Soon after this, we actually get a sort of meta section inside the song to take a breather. Because the text itself, and by the way, this is not marked in any way, if I remember correctly. It's simply written in the text, but it says here, quote, "It is customary here that the Song of Return removes the 176 dead, or might as well be, from the numbers of the 500 for going to war without Ysgramor's leave, who had become now unaccounted, even the Lord of the Wolf's Heart who had ended Borgus, and for this he still wishes Skyrim ill. The annual reckoning of the 13th of Sunsdawn feast for the dead allows the Skald singers to pause for mead and then to hearken the reinforcements from Sovngarde sent by Shor himself to replace the traitors, and whose number reset the sum neatly at Junau's delight, for no march of the sons and daughters of Kine can be ever ended." End quote. Here we get another bunch of deep cut references, so let me just tell you the highlights. Topal, who loved canoes too much. This is obviously a reference to Topal the Pilot, the famous Aldmeri explorer, the first to explore Tamriel in the Merethic era, and here they just say he loved canoes too much. Then there is the name Perif, which is a reference to the water-getting girl and the inverse tiger, Tiber Septim's favorite bedtime story written by Michael Kirkbride. Hen Harlocane, the great-great-grandfather of Gulacane, Emperor Zero, predecessor of Tiber Septim. Hilariously, this entire epic paragraph ends with these words, quote, "If that's not exactly 176 names, it's because I'm drunk and everyone here just yell out your names to make the difference, for you were there as you are here, and let Shor's whole shadow beleaguer you not." End quote. Okay, we're close to the finish line, just 2 paragraphs left. Quote, "And now the 500 were reunited, and Ysgramor sent the 80 ahead to blast the ice with its Varlion's prow, and we were beset upon by the devils we would rule and lose and rule again, but the boat thane was a sacred Tor queen, her skirts and hides covered in southern moths, who made manifest in that coming fight with the crow-headed spirits of the Morag." End quote. Wow. Yeah, the 80 War, the 8-year conflict between the Empire and Morrowind, which ended with a Morag Tong assassination in 2920. What a way to describe that, huh? The text then brings up Pale Pass, the Snake Fighter, a reference to Riemann I, who repelled the Akaviri invasion. The song's 13th and last paragraph is in many ways its most epic one. It opens like this, quote, "With the Morag broken and sent into the eastern slush, we finally caught sight of Snowthroat and knew that our journey was near its ending again. It was the World Eater's waking that broke shore first, shouting our victory and doom, whose boat thane was Ismalithax the Northerly Dragon." End quote, because the song then just names dozens of different dragons, dragon names which I've never heard before. And the last sentence of this paragraph reads as this, quote, "Of those Nords that stepped back onto Skyrim, from the World Eater's waking, there were these among the 500, but Ismalithax counted that the first was his destroyer, Ysgramor the Returned." End quote. And it is here that the song can cyclically return to the beginning. What a crazy text. You know, it's impossible to do it justice in a podcast. I have no idea why I even chose this lore book in the first place for this. Admittedly, some of the latter texts will fit this format much better. They will be more similar to the first and third PGEs, but this one was just crazy. If you listen to the whole thing, I highly appreciate it. If you actually made it through this one, there's a high chance that we will enjoy the text itself, because there is so much I had to leave out. Okay, now it's time for a bit of a palate cleanser, and an interesting one at that. Toward a Dragoned Sea, Cathnoquey. This is another chapter written by Michael Kirkbride himself, and it is in fact the only annotated one, despite the fact that all of the sections were supposed to be annotated initially. It is a sort of matter-of-fact exploration of the region of Cathnoquey, and I think the reason why they chose to go with a much more straightforward way to describe this region is that there simply was nothing to compare it to. Cathnoquey hadn't been described in any of the previous guides in this much detail, and so they just felt like they didn't feel like they had to make it different from what was already established. Now, mind you, this chapter isn't 100% straightforward. There is actually something peculiar here going on, namely the fact that the author gets intercepted by another transmission of the through the dream sleeve about halfway through the text and starts describing it, then it almost feels like this sort of mental breakdown. So I will just get this element of the text out of the way, and then we can focus on the factual stuff, because the factual stuff here is actually really interesting. But first, let me quote an entire paragraph of the writer's thoughts here. Quote, after, and after, and now I have just heard the sounding of many horns. And now, there we are, the stamp of hooves, but they are fashioned so that I can't adequately count their true sum number. I think I have documented all I need to in regards to Cathnoquey, and yet fear that it will never truly be enough, even if some other might take the pen. For that, I am... Wait, no, that's me writing what I'm thinking. No, not right now, not yet. I have only ever served what I knew to be there. I knew it. A knock at your door. End quote. That's quite a puzzling passage, I would say. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. But now, without further ado, let's start speaking properly about the immensely interesting region of Cathnoquey. The island region of Cathnoquey is actually the newest imperial province to be incorporated into the empire. It happened in the year 276 of the Third Era, when Emperor Uriel V, known as the Fighting Diamond, incorporated it into the empire. Decades later, in the year 307, it was formally reorganized under terms of the veto of charter and decree of new lordships. However, this region has an interesting history of independence, because this is essentially an egalitarian society of two very diverse cultures. We've got the Marish Cathnoquey, who are elves living on fishing flotillas floating in the sea. And their society is ruled largely by independent coast shore cans. The other nationality and culture are the men of Cathnoquey, a human nation, who are, according to the author of the text, the supposed quote-unquote untitled leaders of the region. Unlike the Cathnoquey, they are described as living in military frontier fortresses. Now, despite this extreme duality of this region, there are actually no racial tensions to be found. There is no hierarchy as such. And even the way they govern themselves is very interesting. Listen to this. Quote, records testify to a government that convened only in passing, and when it did so passively, structured along a Caesar-lectorate system whose chief concern was the selflessness of melting ice. End quote. How did this work? The author asks, and the answer is, we have no idea. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but throughout the whole Tamriel, I don't think there's another society where government as such doesn't really exist like here. But of course, this is all in the past, and the region was conquered, so let's talk about the conquest. Uriel V, in his streak of conquests after capturing the island of Roscrea, managed to very briefly annex the Cathnoquey archipelago, essentially as an afterthought, as a sort of side quest while he was off conquering other regions. According to the writings of Commander Hungta Torpal, the natives were happy to be conquered. There was no fighting, the surrender happened without demands, and the locals were smiling as the invading army arrived. But the emperor, who was quite a suspicious man, as he had to be since he was conquering all these different cultures, he thought that this might be some sort of a trick. So despite the lack of resistance among the locals, he ordered a crazy sort of massacre that apparently lasted 9 days. Unfortunately, Commander Torpal, who let us know about this massacre, was punished for this, which we know from the annotator, the person who annotated the original text of the second pocket guide. As I said, this is the only chapter that was actually annotated. Quote, I was delighted to hear that Commander Hungta Torpal did indeed exist, and was not another phantasm of the IGS, if only to find out that he had not retired at Anvil as per official record, but rather suffered court-martial for his publications by the Thoniran Regency, and that he and all his four-line were sentenced to ancestralcide in the bellows of Fickledire. End quote. Wow, ancestralcide sounds absolutely brutal. The pacifism displayed here by the Cathnoquey cultures is something that I think is quite foreign to most Tamrieli cultures, and even the imperial author here talks about this. Quote, Cathnoquey culture is at best abstract for our purposes here. As a record of events and ordeals, this is understandably inconvenient for both writer and reader. For that, we can both be sorry, but we must carry on, and will, as evidenced by the existence of the paragraph following. End quote. So there you go. There's also a bit of wit to this text. It's not just like dry descriptions as you would find in the third pocket guide, or highly biased descriptions as you would find in the first one. After the archipelago joined the empire in this way, the later emperors seem to have been more benevolent, and there apparently hasn't been another massacre of this sort there since. Now, at this point, it shouldn't come as a surprise that the relations between the Chimeriquae and the men of Keptu are completely peaceful, but actually there aren't even any relations to speak of. The contact between them is very sparse, and it seems that they only contact each other through specialized rituals. Quote, the best example of this is probably the arrival of the Chimer for market. Moments before the gloaming that signals the break of dawn, the bulk of the flotilla township heaves into view like some incalculable sea turtle, a vast misshapen shadow on the face of the water. Crystalline light sources blink into life atop the flotilla's many masts, giving brief lamplit glimpses of ships that seem at once ramshackle yet sturdy, and shortly thereafter begins an incredible balaic display that turns the very water into an enormous semaphore. The ostensible message of the arrival of trade strikes the outside observer as entirely negligible in view of such a spectacle. Indeed, sometimes it is, as neither party, men or mer, exchange any goods at all, not even immaterial commodities such as information. Even when this not trade happens, however, the merchants of both flotilla and fortress return to their domains with great smiles of satisfaction. End quote. The Chimeriquae spend most of their time at sea in their big flotilla townships, and they are seen pretty much only during these meetings. Now, why do they live on flotilla townships? Nobody knows. We know that once every few weeks they have to stop at a settlement to resupply, and then they set off again to wander the sea. Despite being so peaceful, they seem to like military contests because they occasionally organize these theatrical quote-unquote battles to determine who has the best weapons and tools. Now, I'm using the term battles in very loose terms because there are no casualties to be found in these. Since subjugating the archipelago, the Empire is obviously interested in the motivations of its people, so they have tried to find out why they spend so much time at sea and really just find out more about their culture as a whole. Quote, the Blade Seneschals once sent an emissary, Ellison Voa, to the Shorehans to ascertain if they were somehow following or at least looking for the prophet Veloth, the Chimeri progenitor. Voa returned to Cyrodiil very much angered or confused, saying nothing of the answers the Shorehans gave him, or even if they had given him any. In his final report to the throne on the agenda of the Chimeriquae, which he had to be escorted to, for he seemingly forgot his appointment, Voa refused to write anything more than, I have changed my mind regarding Tamriel. He was relieved of his rank and duties at Skyhaven Temple and spared execution only by virtue of his relations in Old Hagath. End quote. And let's just listen to what the annotator has to say as well. Quote, I visited Old Hagath and held audience with the Elder Council's Ghost Coar of Blades and found no evidence of this so-called Ellison Voa. I did find, however, that the name is an mananagram of Verily Believed in Violence, an old slogan of the Imperial Geographical Society. End quote. That's not me mispronouncing anagram, by the way. I have no idea what a mananagram is. It sounds like something Kirkbride made up, I guess. Either way, this tale about Ellison Voa is interesting. It seems like there's something in the air, something in the atmosphere of Cathnoquey that just completely shifts your way to thinking to be unlike anything else in Tamriel. It sounds really cool. Sounds really intriguing. The men of Quay, for their part, are described as being hospitable and always smiling, but they also give off slight military vibes, For example, because they live in imposing military fortresses, as I've mentioned already. They also use these antiquated weapons, but these are. Weapons is almost too strong of a term for them. They are so blunt that they almost don't even look like weapons. Well, why do they use weapons? Why do they live in fortresses? Are they preparing for battle? Who are they going to fight? Again, nobody knows. Not even the provincial governor appointed by the empire who oversees the place. It could be somehow related to the needs, but it's hard to say. By the way, this is not just my conjecture, I'm actually saying the points that the author mentions in the text. A really unique characteristic of theirs is that they like to draw bulls, as in, male cows. They like to draw bulls a lot. They constantly draw them in answer to any questions that they get asked by outsiders, and they even use bull sketches they draw as currency. They actually pay each other in bull sketches. The imperial writer here conjectures that the men of Keptu are the long-lost Nedic Keptulates of Alt-Sirod. And the annotator responds to this with not just one but two annotations. Quote, "These long-lost Keptulates have only ever appeared in heretical portrayals of the Elysian Revolution as proof of some theory that the Needs were indigenous to Tamriel. I believe this might mark the first time that the IGS has slipped back into its commissioned duty, to wit, a document of our unified empire, only to fail immediately. Every educated citizen knows that the Needs came from Atmora." End quote. And now their second annotation, which was added later. Quote, "I rescind my earlier comment about the IGS actually doing the will of the throne. I have just read the section on Cyrodiil, and the survey's agenda is clear, and clearly the work of historians of the Rephagian vein." End quote. If you're asking what the historians of the Rephagian vein believe, good luck figuring that out, because Rephagian is not mentioned anywhere else in Elder Scrolls lore. Because of these ubiquitous bull sketches, the Empire during their conquest of Cathnoquey assumed that the men were hiding cattle somewhere, and since they needed supplies for Akavir, they really made an effort to find this hidden cattle. They even tortured the natives to find it, but obviously there was none. Later, after the persecution, missionaries of Stendar actually hypothesized that showing these men of Cathnoquey images from the Ayleid hegemony might remind them of something. It might trigger something in their subconscious, something of their past, but it didn't. When they were shown Quay images from this period, they just started drawing bulls on top of them. To end the Cathnoquey chapter, the Imperial author also describes the most notable place found in the archipelago, the so-called Wasabi Run. After the Imperial invasion of Akavir failed, the Empire seemingly had no reason to keep their legions in Cathnoquey, but then they discovered the Wasabi Run. It seems to be a couple of small islands covered in, quote, "swirling garden crops of a Tibrol-based wasabi," end quote. And this seems to be highly valuable because the Empire proceeded to exploit the hell out of it. Now, obviously, since they wanted more and more, they also asked the locals if they had planted this or how it got there in the first place. Quote, "When their untitled leaders were questioned how it got there and who its gardeners were, they merely told the Imperials that it showed up when you did." Under torture, the origins of the Wasabi Run and its careful cultivation were made even less clear, with variations of a single answer. You needed something from Cathnoquey, so it gave it to you. You are Quay now, so stop hurting yourself. End quote. What an absolutely unique culture, unique place, unique way of thinking. It's a shame we never got to see it in any of the games, but there is a silver lining because Morrowind modders are working on this region as well. The Heart of Heaven and the Imperial Earth, Cyrodiil. The Imperial Library tells us that the passage on Cyrodiil was very contentious. For one thing, it was supposed to be a follow-up to the legendary passage in the Third Pocket Guide, which was in many ways foundational to what became Monkey Truth. But then, of course, Oblivion came out. The Elder Scrolls 4 came out, which changed the Cyrodiilic jungle into a more generic European countryside. And as such, the game was generally disliked by the type of lore freaks that took part in writing this document, and generally fans of the old lore. So obviously, the big question became, well, what to do about the jungle? Now, there were obviously several options. You could have treated it as if Cyrodiil had always been supposed to be a jungle, or you could ignore Oblivion entirely and you could treat Cyrodiil as if it still is a jungle, or you could try to explain the transition in some way. And this is what they ended up going with. Let me read you the winning pitch for the final text, which was written by Adonorsil. Quote, Cyrodiil is dying, and it's already gone from a jungle to a temperate area. The next step is obvious. How about we write the Cyrodiil section from the future, in which the whole place is now a frozen wasteland, not unlike that other human homeland that got too cold. Only it's not from the future, but from the Middle Dawn, which obviously affected no province more than Cyrodiil. The chapter therefore suddenly gains a warning undercurrent, written by Alessians in the snow. End quote. Now, in case you're not aware, the Middle Dawn is supposed to be the longest known dragon break that's ever occurred in Tamriel. It was reportedly caused by the Maracati Selective, which is this sect of the Alessian Order. But yeah, so the pitch tells us that this depiction of Cyrodiil will be literally from a completely different time. Now, the text itself. It opens with a sort of technical note, telling us that the text that we're about to read is actually not the censored text, not the text written by the PGE2 author, which was censored by the Empress's committee. It appears to be a sort of supplement which accidentally, replaced the original and left only brief intro paragraphs plus a few words of the original here and there. The authors of this text are apparently using the acclaimed Cyrodiil index, whatever that is, as the standard to judge which information is good and which information was false and therefore shouldn't be kept. But as soon as they start explaining the intricacies of this, the paragraph gets interrupted by a gradual introduction of a different stream of thoughts, meaning that suddenly a few words here and there are written in cursive, which I imagine is this sort of blending of two different streams of thought, and therefore it's very difficult to understand what's actually going on there. The two streams keep interrupting each other, which is why I'm having such a hard time making sense of it. It seems that Her Majesty, Queen Morahatha, has requested some kind of document to be physically present on her so that she can preserve it, I believe. Quote, with all our scarce resources spent on the preservation of the entire Cyphermoth library, it is our hope that Your Majesty's physical presence may provide the aforementioned text with some alternative method of reinsertion. End quote. And now that we're past the technical note and the opening few paragraphs, the document itself is actually a sort of deeply personal letter. Let me start with an extended quote so that you understand what I mean. Quote, it pains me that I must tell you this so soon. You are only just beginning, young and full of promise among the grand machinations of heaven. Perhaps I should have told you from the very start. The day may be legend to you, but I still recall that grand new moment, newer than ever before, when you stretched me across the stars and claimed the cosmos as your own. You were beautiful, as rebels alone can be, and I have loved you ever since. I could not bear to see the wildfire of your hope extinguished then. Still, it is time that you knew. The truth is simple. I am dying. The world of New Cyrod cannot support you much longer. I will fold under my own weight before another of your generations has completed its life in blissful ignorance. For all your good intentions, children, you have built me on false foundations. I am doomed, but I intend to offer you a final means of escape. I will tell you what happened, so you remember. I will tell you what is happening, so you understand. Also, I will tell you what must be done, so you may yet have a second chance. End quote. So yes, this is a letter from Cyrodiil to her children, to the people of Cyrodiil and maybe even the people of Tamriel as a whole. New Cyrod is spelled with an NU at the beginning, which, Michael Kirkbride often uses this sort of prefix like in Numantia or other names. My understanding is that it does basically mean new, as in N-E-W. It's just spelled differently. So then, Nusserad, or Cyrodiil herself, goes on to explain that the stories which are today understood to be fictional by the children were once real. She mentions several different myths, none of which really mean anything to me. For example, the Tempes holds of your legendary cousins, or the Embermen of the Once East, or the Bogdans of Vergon. And then she mentions the first of your dynasty, the brave men and women of Al Marug. Now, I checked. Al Marug is mentioned nowhere else in the lore. My guess is that it's related to the prophet Maruk, because it's spelled, almost the same, except the K is replaced with a G. But yeah, these brave men and women were caught in the world of an inept god, but managed to repudiate him. Quote, suffice it to say that with their repudiarch gone, the Al Marug rearranged their kingdom as befitting the newfound grandeur of man. The map was stretched in impossible directions, city became land became world, and so was born Nusserad. End quote. I mean, it's not surprising that I've never heard of the Al Marug, considering that we're reading an account of Cyrodiil from the future, right? So there's bound to be a lot of stuff that we don't really know about. That being said, if I'm missing something, please tell me in the comments. So Nusserad was supposed to prepare her children for their final endeavor, but they seem to have forgotten their purpose. She tells them, quote, your time here is running out, for you have killed time, end quote. And talks about the fleeing refugees, the moth swarms mass migrating to the capital, the desperate children flocking to shrines of half-remembered saints, such as Saint Eliatosh or Uriatosh the Ferryman. Again, these saint names are not ones we've seen before. They obviously have the same ending as Akatosh, so they are probably somehow related to time. Uriatosh kind of sounds like Charon from Greek myths, right? But yeah, we're basically getting a sort of vision of the future apocalypse that will befall Tamriel, so we really need to use our imagination here. Now, whatever cataclysm has befallen Nusserad, the children, or the refugees, have sent envoys from Nunibin out into the snow, which is clearly not just snow. It seems to be some kind of horrible substance. Quote, snow, you call it, as if this degenerate substance could be likened to any you might encounter from Jeralinopel to the vapor mines of Subanader, colorless and without texture, intangible like an early childhood memory, and impossible to fix your gaze upon. Its only characteristic is that it does not belong. Nusserad then goes on to predict that from the envoys that the children have sent out, few will come back alive, and those will become alien. They will start speaking long dead or long unborn languages. But the wasteland out there is still full of souls. These are flocks of isolated, frightened souls. Quote, travel is impossible as destinations have become meaningless. Where the jungle trails are crossed by a vagrant bridging event, they follow impossible loops, and the traveler with a brisk pace soon comes within sight of himself. Waterways are similarly unreliable. Look up on any river and you will see the same flotsam enter, exit, and re-enter your view. End quote. The refugees essentially now live their lives in endless nights full of terror. Time is running out. Quote, one day soon, when the stars are hidden, your heavy-hearted empress will tear a key from her wrist chain and have copies careered to all the Carnelian gates of New Nibenion. End quote. Well, and if you're expecting some sort of cohesive ending to this crazy apocalyptic cataclysmic vision, we're not getting one, because the stream, the emission, the signal that we are actually reading this document from is suddenly interrupted. Quote, halt! Violation of transmission law subarticle 15. Desist immediately. Engaging counter notions. Halt! Failure to desist. Analyzing notional signature. Channel disrupted. Do not attempt to travel until visited by Thalmor agent for questioning. End quote. The last paragraph of the transmission is so heavily fragmented that I literally cannot tell what's even going on. And that's it for Cyrodiil. Tatterdemalion, the lunar province of Secunda. Yes, that's right, we're going to the moon. Some of you listening to this might not even be aware that there are supposed to be imperial colonies on Secunda, but there you go. I think the best way to explain it is just reading Michael Kirkbride's pitch. Quote, Tatterdemalion is going to take the middle road to all of this. It cannot combat the beautifully sublime Elsweyr on the moon with one more overtly comedic through line of hijinks. It's going to be matter of fact, inasmuch as portraying void moths, imperial moon suits, and dead god geography can try without falling into crazed blabber. It knows it's been waiting to come out for a while, so all excitement will have to be tempered with my best attempt at the encyclopedic monotone that I can muster. I suspect it will be the section that most emulates my work on the original PGE. End quote. So there we go, we're getting a nice, easy to understand section, to take a break from all this crazy experimental stuff. Unfortunately, the result are just a few short paragraphs, but not just the paragraphs, we also got two really cool images out of this. One of those is the Imperial Manonaut, drawn by Lady Nerevar. There's also a Morrowind mod based on this image, by the way, or, on the whole concept of Imperial Manonauts. And the other piece of art is the Moth Vessel Fortress, drawn by Lootmoth. Well then, how did the Empire conquer the moon? The project was actually started by Emperor Riemann I, who lived in the First Era, in the 28th century. So, unlike the previous section where we went far into the future, here we're staying squarely in the established past of Tamriel. Now, Riemann I was, of course, the founder of the Riemann dynasty, but apparently, after losing his midwife wives, his grief made him prideful, is how the text puts it. I guess he just wanted something to do with his time, to get distracted from his grief, so he just started planning to colonize the moons. This was in the year 2757 of the First Era, and the fun part of this is that he didn't really consult anyone on this, he didn't even pay attention to his lord, he just started planning. Quote, he commissioned the Necronax of the Immaterial Harmonics Institute of Incongruitech and Extrinsic Travels to begin work on the first gen-engineered megalomoth vessel fortresses, to reclaim all extramundic holdings and grant lands from the maddening nighttime tatters of Shazar's proof of man's provenance. End quote. Wow, that was a mouthful. Kudos if you understood half of this. Naturally, the Elder Council wasn't happy with this. Specifically, they were afraid that this could anger the Daedra. But quite unexpectedly, the 16 Daedra formed a coalition. This was actually the first time they've done something like this since the fall of League in the previous Kalpa. And they formed this coalition on the basis of their Nymic oaths. Oaths on their own names, which, if you know anything about the Daedra, this is a big deal, right? This basically means that these oaths are likely unbreakable, given the role that names play for the Daedra. Unfortunately, we don't know why they formed this coalition, what they stood to gain by doing this. The text conjectures that it must have been the machinations of Nocturnal, but we don't know for certain. Anyway, so Riemann started planning his Megalomoth Vessel Fortress, which was supposed to be called NVN Manywife with Interest. Interesting name for sure. Unfortunately, he could not finish his construction of this vessel fortress because he was killed by the Morak Tong before he could see it through. Of course, we know from the lore that this is exactly what happened to him. So the fortress was actually built by Riemann II and renamed to NVN Akrul. I'd love to provide some extra context on this, but I'm not sure if there is any. The text is very short, as I said, so we're basically given very little and left wanting more, which, come to think of it, is basically what the Elder Scrolls lore does the best. Anyway, the text itself concludes with a quote from the records of Bethelamed Greaves, Imperial Manonaut of the New Void Navy. Quote, Diamond in Diamond Ziggurat, vessel of Moth beholds Riemann in Riemann. Let it be known that even the palaces of Cyrodiil will bow their heads gracefully to their emperor. Our eyes as sigils, spinning like plates in effort to lift beyond the Primundus toward Shazar Mausoleum Corpse land grab. End quote. Make of that what you will. The Warped West, Hiauroch. Yeah, instead of being called High Rock, here the province is called, this sort of weird word with a bunch of accents that I don't know how to read, so I'm just going to pronounce it as Hiauroch. This is one of the most revised chapters of the second pocket guide, and as you will see, there is a very good reason for that. Once again, the authors felt the need to make this one a bit different from what came before in the first and third pocket guides, and with High Rock, there is also the added factor of High Rock being a fairly medieval European province, which is sort of generic by its own nature. So how do we present that as fantastical without completely retconning everything? There is also the matter of the different endings to Daggerfall, because, well, I haven't played Daggerfall myself, but from what I know, there are several very different endings based on the player's choices. So we kind of have to accommodate all of them. We don't want to invalidate any of these choices. Some members of the Temple Zero Society suggested borrowing aesthetics from other cultures or Elizabethan/Victorian occultism. Another suggestion was to omit Iliac Bay, which is pretty well documented, and focus on Greater Bethany instead, which is less so and also just has more potential for inventing cool lore. The chapter was written by a member of the society called Luagar, who ended up writing and rewriting it in several separate drafts, and you will quickly come to understand why, because this is, I would say, this is the most complicated section of the entire second pocket guide. So we will only read the final version. But before we get to it, let me break down the premise, because it will make it a lot easier for you to understand. The central premise of this chapter is that High Rock is broken by time, and all eras exist here simultaneously. Time is nebulous. Figures from all eras pop up and intersect, discussing things with each other. So essentially, while the Skyrim chapter blended elements of the past, High Rock just completely shatters the entire timeline, blending elements of past and future and present, depending on what you would consider the present. And to understand this, we have to come back to the fact that there are different endings to Daggerfall, right? There is this lore book called The Warp in the West, which basically attempts to explain this. It tells us that Iliac Bay was wrecked by war, but then something happened, and suddenly the province turned into a bunch of peaceful modern countries, Sentinel, Wayrest, Orsinium, even Hammerfell is listed here. And this whole unexplainable event is called the Miracle of Peace or the Warp in the West, and is generally attributed to the divines as a sort of a divine miracle. There are reports of remarkable events going on, armies being mysteriously transported great distances or annihilated, colossal storms, mass disappearances, just all around craziness to explain the different endings to Daggerfall. This was Bethesda's way to reconcile the different endings without invalidating any of them. And the genius idea behind this chapter of the Pocket Guide is to expand on this concept. Now, let me read you the paragraph which prefaces the entire chapter. Quote, "The Temple of the Sun, known as Hiauroch, High Rock in the officials, is described by scholars as a layered menagerie of lands for which each era's king stands before its convention to plead the case for their season. The Castellans have limited attendance to presiding officials and delegates due to fears of invasion by forces of which they refuse to speak." End quote. So let's break that down. Each era, and at the same time each region of High Rock, has its own representative called a Castellan. And these Castellans are all debating each other across places, across eras, just to figure out what season, what era it currently is. And their whole aim here is to resolve the warp in the West. Yes, this is absolutely crazy, and I love it. So the rest of the entire chapter are just notes of the court stenographers writing down the different arguments that the Castellans put forward. But they are also edited versions of these arguments, edited for the Imperial Geographic Society because the society only had access to them in a highly monitored way. The Castellans are from different eras, from the first all the way to the fourth, which I'll just remind you first appeared in The Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, which came out just a few months, I would say, before this chapter. And they are not even listed in chronological order. So making sense of them has been and will be quite the challenge. Now let's go over the individual statements. So the first one is from Finaster, Saint Lord of Govardon, Castellan of Balfiera, and he argues for the year 417 of the Third Era. On the timeline, this would place it 10 years before Morrowind takes place, and geographically, Balfiera is an island, the site of the Adamantine Tower, which is of course the oldest structure on Tamriel. But the speaker being Finaster, that's actually the name of an Altmer god, so what is he doing here arguing for Balfiera of this particular time? The book Varieties of Faith describes Finaster as the, quote, hero god of the Summerset Isles who taught the Altmer how to naturally live another 100 years by using a shorter walking stride, end quote. He's also associated with the Ring of Finaster, a powerful artifact. And yeah, what's he doing here? Great question. I don't have any answers. Finaster assures his listeners that they are all working to reconcile the eras and are hopeful that they will avoid significant inconsistencies. He mentions that the Numidium and the Mantella, which was the gem that powered the Numidium, are locked up, although the IGS editor here actually notes that they've been unable to confirm whether this is actually the case. Finaster then tells us that he will completely skip the origins of Bretons and Men and Mer, which was described in the first guide, and to summarize their current efforts, he says this, quote, our current efforts are primarily focused on the Jehani, who have recently been granted 2 ports in Farran to be in order to compensate their loss of pewter smithing and the highly lucrative trade with Hafingar. With such obstacles out of the way, we will soon transition into the agreed-upon 3E340 objectives with minimal delay. As of yet, Hjaroch's configuration still contains 4 of the 8 primary citadels, Normar, Hrothgar, the Eilesen Hills, and the Bjolsey. Thus, in order, end quote, because here the text ends abruptly. And by the way, about those Third Era 340 objectives, let me just remind you that according to the timeline here, those objectives were supposed to be achieved 77 years before he gave this speech. The next speaker is Arrhenius, Archduke of Daggerfall, representing the Kingdom of Daggerfall, in the year 267 of the Third Era. He describes Daggerfall as a sprawling urban territory. Quote, each city begins before its neighbor has ended, overlapping until only the locals can tell whether they are in Bethany, Wayrest, or the Eltheric. Editor's note, the IGS was told that pageants of wit and cunning determined the official borders, though we were unable to ascertain whether borders exist at all. End quote. The formerly forested Eilesen Hills are now a long cobblestone street full of markets, citadels of merchant kings, and kings' courts. The south, meanwhile, is the home of sages and sorcerers developing new rites and charms. Only the region known as Delesia, or the Delese Isles, are distinguishable from the rest of Daggerfall, and this is the consequence of the Dawn Schism. If you have any idea what the Dawn Schism is, let me know, because I cannot think of anything. It sounds like an event in the Dawn era, but which one in particular? I'm not sure, honestly. Anyway, so Daggerfall is essentially forever expanding, which, seems kind of like a synonym for conquest, right? It seems to be conquering other nations, although this is never said explicitly. But at some point, this crazy expansion seems to have stopped, or at least slowed down, because of the canonization of Finaster. Canonization, of course, being the proclaiming someone as a saint. So when Finaster was canonized, Arrhenius tells us that he had to leave off his imperial projects in order to manage his pantheon, which seems to have slowed down the rapid growth process. Apparently, in Daggerfall, everyone feels at home and also as a foreigner at the same time. There are some inhabitants who are afraid that the Direni will threaten the tower, but apparently the Direni don't exist, is what Arrhenius tells us. He concludes his speech with these words, quote, we have expanded and progressed this nation beyond anything our forefathers could have fathomed. We have refined this empire, swept away the dross of old wars and lesser magics. I only ask what logic stands in regressing Hjaroch to the barbarity of the past. End quote. The next speaker is Enganadel, founder of the Cumberland dynasty, speaking for 2E827. Now, House Cumberland is mostly mentioned in ESO. In fact, it appears there as the rulers of Wayrest. And ESO, of course, came out after this entry in the Pocket Guide, so I'm wondering whether the ESO writers got a bit inspired here. But Enganadel here describes Hrothgar, which is this sky-high mountainous kingdom home to many sanctums to the sun. He mentions several of those sanctums, like the monocrystal courts of Camlorn, or the prismatic temple of Daggerfall, or the fractal Cecilum of Evermore, which floats 12 inches above the ground in anticipation of each dawn. And each of these sanctums These shrines to the sun are surrounded by holidays. Surrounded by holidays hinting at different historical events. For example, quote, Magnus forging Hjaurok from the remains of solar Atronax after besting their monarch in a duel of hammers. End quote. Magnus, of course, being the god of magic and architect of Mundus. Or another holiday, quote, the Day of Rain, traditionally celebrated on the 8th of sun's dusk, is set aside in the memory of Nemoli, the blue spark. And actually, here we get a little sidebar section talking just about Nemoli. Nemoli is actually kind of a fascinating figure. She's one of the Magna Gei and daughter of Magnus, who is worshipped in some of the elven pantheons. She secretly wanted to marry Akatosh, the god of time, but he was always way too fascinated with Nirn to pay any attention to Nemoli, so she distilled her promise of her love for him into the Veil of Nirn. And when Magnus, her father, saw this, he got angry at her and actually decided that he wanted to leave the lesser gods behind. So he decided to marry and have children. But Nemoli saw or felt that his children would scourge the life from Nirn, so she decided on a pretty radical solution. She seduced Magnus, her own father, so that he would chase her into the void, and together they birthed the distant stars. That's right, that's the explanation for stars in Tamriel. Quote, now Nemoli can only be seen through the mists of her own mysteries as the blue spark, the harbinger of untime, for not even the mighty Magnus dares approach the time god during his madness. It is only then that Nemoli may rest and lament over the torment of her lost love, and that is the origin of the raining stars, the tears of Nemoli. End quote. Anyway, just to round off the list of remarkable holidays celebrated in these sanctums to the sun, here is the last one. Quote, of the most revered is Mina Obe, which marks the end of the interregnum through the decanonization of Fynaster, allowing him free reign in setting the lands aright. From his hand Hjalti went, summoned by the non-saint to uncoil the throne of Nibenium. End quote. The interregnum is of course the period in which there were no actual emperors, no actual rulers to the Empire of Tamriel in the second half of the Second Era. It was mostly petty pretenders fighting over the imperial throne, unsuccessfully. And as for Hjalti, that is one of Tiber Septim's names. Now here we can also see that the canonization and decanonization of Fynaster is becoming a bit of a recurring theme, and we will hear more about it in the upcoming speeches. Enganadals ends with these words, quote, a lasting effect of Fynaster's recanonization was the emergence of the Direni menace, whom we fought until we no longer knew why. Then the Orsimer came from atop the dunes, and we remembered. For 30 years we remembered until the foulest period of history was cast into the mountains. We cast it away as we have all such vulgarities. This is Hjaurok in its truest, a mountainous temple reaching the sun. It cannot be denied by man or mer, and with the Mantella, its majesty will envelop the skies. End quote. Just a brief side note here, I haven't played ESO, but I feel like this is something that they could have totally elaborated on in that game. So if you've played the game, let me know if they did something with this. Our next speaker is Aishirion, Templar to Hans the Fox at North Point. Now, he's speaking from the point of view of the year 452 of the Third Era, which, if you think about it, is nonsense because the Third Era ends with 433. So yeah, the timeline is getting even wackier. Now, Hans the Fox is actually just another name for Pelinal Whitestrake, the legendary demigod. Aishirion here describes his region as follows, quote, severe inaccessible canyons, vast grim wastes alternating with the burnt ruins of Daggerfall, Bethany and Evermore. This is Normar, whose peoples range from the Reachmen of the north, from whom the mountain witch kings trace their roots, to the druidic nobles of Icolon. It is described as a land of deep piety, but also commerce. The local notion of piety seems to be mostly related to survival, because this is a very hostile land, and anytime you come across an oasis, a place of respite, you feel the need to thank the gods. So actually the word oasis is here tantamount to prayer. As for commerce, this is what we learn. Quote, the accountant kings of Camlorn specialize in the trade of Nemofex glyphs, body paints, and song salts. The Biolse River region, which more closely resembles a muddy stream than it does a river, instead exports people. Its shamans, sages, and artisans are prized throughout the empire." End quote. Although the land is now at peace, historically it has suffered the grueling Siege of Adamantine. Quote, "The re-decanonization of Finaster stands as a pylon beginning at the Siege of Adamantine, unending till the retaking of Balfiera in the late Mnemolic era." End quote. Mnemolic era, huh? Haven't heard that before. Anyway, we actually get an entire sidebar entry on the Siege of Adamantine. The siege was carried out by Hjalti, or, Tiber Septim, in his efforts to conquer Alinor. But at one point, Finaster appeared and, let's say, expressed his opinions on this. He told Tiber Septim that Adamantine is not to be gained by force. And I think I'll read the rest of his speech word for word. Quote, "When its inner fold is reached, a cavern terrace is opened, rich in the bones of unborn men drawing deep into a sanctum too chilling for any but the indomitable to dare go forward. The whole land is this tower, truly sacred, both worthy of being inhabited by stars and known to be so. It is all fruitful, a fertile fair home for you, and many an arduous hour had Magnus, many a pharaoh fray with the earth Atronax, or bloody council with the Carvanastic lords, before he could make it thus. And now you wish to eclipse Magnus, as you did Alduin and Shazar before? Lord Septim..." End quote, because whatever was supposed to come after Lord Septim is here extracted. As for Aishirion, the speaker for North Point, he ends his speech with this, quote, "Through toil and pain we have learned from the mistakes of our predecessors. Do not doom us to repeat their folly. Let us begin again, forging Hiauroch anew and reviving the spirit of this land." End quote. Well, and our last major speaker is Edquinketu of Biolse, speaking from the year 108 of the 4th era, meaning this would be approximately 100 years before the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim takes place. But yeah, we're actually getting the perspective of the river tribes. The speech opens with this almost allegorical description. Listen to this, quote, "On the surface, the river and its tributaries are ruled by a council of ship captains in the Nedic tradition. Historically, this has been a quintet consisting of Finaster, of the spire This Way to Rest, Yifer, of the spire As I Declare, Magnus, of the spire OK Watch, and the Direni siblings of the spire Balfiera. The fifth member, Sheor, of the spire Carapace, has been dismissed for disorderly conduct." End quote. So yeah, we can clearly identify some key names here, like Finaster, whose spire is a pun on Wayrest, also kind of corresponds to his domain of wayfaring as a patron deity. Yifer sounds a lot like Ifrey, which is this Bosmer entity, of course, the most important Bosmer entity, the god of the forest and the author of Principles of Nature and Life on Nirn. I'm not sure why Magnus' spire is called OK Watch. My guess is that it has something to do with the Eye of Magnus, with his association with seeing. As for the Direni siblings, I have no idea who those could be. It could possibly refer to the founding figures of the Direni clan, but I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments if you know. And Sheor is of course Shore, but again, why is his spire called Carapace? I feel like there's a lot going over my head here. But after this kind of cryptic paragraph, we learn more about the Biolse river tribes, who live apparently below the water. They rarely appear on surface. They are actually served by the Lamia. If you know the Lamia, these sort of water creatures, they are actually the servants of the river tribes, apparently. They also like doing business with their dreg neighbors. And generally, the river tribes are described as pale beings who seem to levitate through the water rather than swim. As for their origins, they are unknown, but we do know that their first contact with the Empire happened when the Empire sent an expedition to chart the Biolse. Apparently, at this point, they found that Finaster had canonized himself again, and this led to skirmishes between Hiauroch and Direni fleets. Now, the shamans of the Biolse River tribes were actually quite powerful, and the editor tells us here that they've historically decided many Iliac wars, even destroying Bethany incalculable times through their magics. But there hasn't been any decisive victory to end these skirmishes, and they are currently at a 30-year stalemate. Eleanor, for its part, is taking advantage of the situation. They've invited the Biolse River tribes to the city to treat with them many times, and after ignoring them many times, the river tribes have cautiously accepted their latest invitation. So, this is where the bulk of the chapter ends, but we have two more speakers who are described by the author as minor delegates. The first is Mrognag Grothrolden, lieutenant to Altulgrag, speaking from 950 of the First Era. And I can summarize this rather quickly. Basically, after the Dwemer disappeared, orcs walked for 250 years from Red Mountain until they finally found Orsinium, and this is basically an orc's account of that. And the last speaker is Serracano, Direni arbitrator and castellan of Balfiera in 4E 109. I'm just going to read his entire speech, his entire paragraph to you. Quote, "It is a pleasure to see that the delegates of High Rock have seen reason and come to treaty out our tower. A fine assembly indeed, even Enganedel, whose era I thought we'd purged with the Black Star. Whether or not any miraculous peace is achieved here today, the councils of crystal-like law assure me that the Mantella will be distributed in our favor. This siege will be its last." End quote. The crystal-like law here is referring to the Crystal Tower. The tower is actually called this in a book from the Elder Scrolls V called Rising Threat. So, what to make of this entire chapter? I have to say, trying to convey it to you through audio has been a real challenge, because this is simply best enjoyed if you read it for yourself. There is a lot here that is left unsaid, a lot of it that is left to the reader's interpretation, and I've been trying to give an interpretation of some things that I caught on, but I feel like a lot of this chapter is just going over my head and would require even more background research than I've already done. I've already revised my notes like 3 or 4 times, and it still feels like I'm recording this incoherent mess. So I would definitely recommend you read this one, at least the Hyaurach one, for yourself. And I can assure you that the rest of the chapters are going to be way more straightforward. So if you enjoyed this one, I think the rest will be even better. Even, well, certainly easier to understand. Westward Serpent's Lie, Hammerfell. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a single word of this chapter written, and I'll just read you the account of the Imperial Library of why this is the case. Quote, "Hammerfell was one of the least worked on sections of the second pocket guide. Baruch and Lady Nerevar signed up to take ownership of it, since they had both spent the last half-decade on Tamriel Rebuild's Hammerfell project, but outside of brainstorming a basic thesis, no work was done. The core idea was that a united Hammerfell would be the worst threat the Empire has ever faced, proposed by Lady Nerevar, as well as, if that's true, why haven't they done it yet? Retort by Michael Kirkbride. A variety of ideas were suggested, centering chiefly around the relationship to Yokuda and or Tiber Septim, but nothing stuck." End quote. So in truth, the only thing we have is the title, Westward Serpent's Lie, and even this was not in the original outline, but it was taken from a proposal by Baruch. It's a shame about the chapter, because I think this could have been pretty cool, but as it is, we'll have to move on to the next one. Tenders to the Main, Elsweyr. Yes, this chapter is all about the province of Elsweyr and its inhabitants, the Khajiit. But wait, why does it say Elsweyr and not Elsweyr? Isn't Elsweyr supposed to be like the Khajiit paradise? The place promised to their souls by the Main? Well, yes, it is, although it is usually spelled differently with an apostrophe. And we might gradually come to understand what the author meant by this. This chapter was written by Adonorsil, and the art for it was made by the Oldye Bard. And this time, the Imperial Library doesn't really tell us much extra info about its origins, so we can get straight into the chapter. This is a very comprehensive, in many ways more classic take on what a pocket guide entry would be like. But actually, it opens with a sort of meta paragraph about how the document we are about to read was carried across the Geral Mountains by someone called Confrater Elk. And it is only thanks to their efforts that we even have access to this. By we, I actually mean the Temple Zero Society, because the paragraph explains that the society has regained foothold in the Free North, and that's why they can even show us the rest of the unpublished guide. The Khajiit appear even in early legends, so it's unclear where exactly they come from or for how long they have existed. Apparently there are Nedic tattoos which suggest that the Nedic men thought them allies of, quote, the large cats that stalked the jungles of ancient Cyrodiil, end quote. Regardless, historically the Khajiit have played very minor roles in the geopolitics of Tamriel, of the Empire, and this changed in the year 302 of the Interregnum era, according to the author, which I just find really strange because from what we know, first of all, this is supposed to be the second era, but honestly I've never heard it called the Interregnum era before and it doesn't make much sense to me. And also the year is a bit off, I think. It should be like 307. Anyway, at this point, their nation was finally unified because up until that point, the Khajiit lived in two large, let's say, states or realms. One of them was the Nequinal Desert, which had been conquered by Battlecat Dro Sarba Kergo, and the other were the Palatine Wetlands, estates of Sugar Queen Esgita. These two Khajiit got married, and together their monarchy ruled all of Khajiitdom. Wow, Khajiitdom, that's a cool word. But historians think of them as quite incompetent rulers, because their union ultimately ended up with the Khajiit revolting against them. But the author of this pocket guide entry actually provides some arguments for why they should not be blamed for this. For one, by this time, Riemund's realm, Riemund's empire as a whole, was already falling apart, so this was just a further consequence of that. And also, more importantly, the author ascertains that the Khajiit are just too individualistic to pledge allegiance to an abstract entity like a state or just something greater than themselves. Here the author also mentions that certain ethnic turmoils were going on between the Khajiit, which is strange to me because the first pocket guide explicitly tells us that there is no racial discrimination among the Khajiit species based on one's form. So maybe I'm just misinterpreting what is meant by ethnic turmoils actually. It could just be referring to the hostility between the two states. Regardless, the revolt was ended by the intervention of Main Rit Dharidatta. Historically, the Main has been this sort of spiritual leader for the Khajiit, who has also by this act become a sort of political leader, because his intervention basically made it so that the political power in Elsweyr is based on the turning of the moons. The two opposing sides, opposing factions, basically take their turns to rule based on the configuration of the moons, which is sacred to the species, so there really is no way to go against that. If you want to hear more about this, it's explained more in the first pocket guide, so you might consider listening to my podcast on that. So, since then, the Mains have been overseeing politics in Elsweyr, and because of this, the author tells us that Lesweyr is exceptionally prosperous and tranquil, but also secretive, because the other countries don't really know much about what is going on there. This is also something that was mentioned in the first pocket guide. Now, let me read you an extended quote of how exactly this dispute was resolved, because I just love it. It's so charming with its use of language. Listen to this, quote, "So Main saw that Khajiit was fighting itself more than usual and donned the hairs of his many littermates and his clan and his guards until he could bear no more, and then palanquin raced throughout the lands to repeat these words. Woe ho now, mad cat! You fight and fight, but if you will give Main just one moment, he will show something far better, for the Main has had many hours and fine sugar to think this over. Come now, Palatit, come now, Nequinit. Together, just this once, Khajiit will stand tall as Alkosh, cat upon cat upon cat, and in doing so, it will climb to the moon as it has been told so many times." Khajiit saw reason in these words, and so it climbed and climbed, cat upon cat, for 100 days. Much sugar was brought there to support the climbers, and in the end Khajiit climbed high, so very high that it was in fact closer to Secunda than to Nerni below. And at that moment, little Alfik fell upwards, and from there on Khajiit helped Khajiit up, which was down, until all were gathered there. This is where Khajiit intends to stay from now on, for who could know strife when walking sugar and not sand? End quote. So hang on, the Khajiit climbed up until up was down. Is this why the chapter is titled Elsweyr instead of Elsweyr? The author seems to be implying that the Khajiit, or at least some of them, have ascended to this sort of spiritual paradise of theirs, but also he's just trying to describe Elsweyr the province. Interesting. The next section, which treats geography though, seems to just describe the good old Tamrielic province of Elsweyr. The author notes that all outsiders view Elsweyr as basically this sort of desolate badlands where there is no diversity, nothing of interest really, just endless dunes and sand. The author then explains, quote, "This sorry reputation is engendered largely by the fact that any cartographic expedition into Khajiit territory requires either meticulous metamundal vectors to travel by brute force, or the rare imperial disposition to submit to a deep and prolonged sugar trance." End quote. Now that is very interesting. It seems like it's impossible to traverse Elsweyr without external aid, let's say. And this idea is something that we will also see in the Argonia section. Spoilers ahead. But the author then goes on to explain that those who actually do explore the province are fascinated by it. For one thing, even the Badlands are actually quite diverse in their own, more detailed way. Quote, "More daring pioneers, however, report a fascinating landscape of silver sands bathing in a plethora of colors our own atmosphere cannot permit. The north of the province is typified by powder dune seas, interspersed with crystalline mesas that provide homes for those cats who saw nomadic life as crucial to their definition of a perfect state. In the northeast, the terrain gradually gives way to the broad gorge of the Nibna Twin, a river which now lies unused. The oases that dot the prairies in the center of the land are rumored to be among the most splendorous on the lunar surface and curiously retain the same indigo hue in the bright solar seasons, the fleeting shadow of Jode's monthly passing, or the cool slumber of the 4 months' night. A remarkable phenomenon can be witnessed in these plains on certain blessed nights when streams of etheric refuse spontaneously combust in the pale Nirn shrine to form phantasms instructing the cats in the meanings of stars." End quote. That is just a beautiful description, and one which seems to leave no doubt that we are describing Elsweyr and not the actual Tamrielic Elsweyr. But the next section will take us into certain cities which we know are on Elsweyr, so what's up with that? Ultimately, it seems to me that thinking of Elsweyr and Lesweyr as this sort of dichotomy is completely wrong. It's completely backwards, and the authors are actually trying to blend the two to sort of communicate the idea that there isn't really much of a difference between the two. Again, this is just another twist on the classic pocket guide entry, and I'm here for it. So let's talk about the different places in Elsweyr/Lesweyr. First of all, Senchal. Senchal is described as the most mundane city and a commercial hub of the province. It is also a structureless nightmare to navigate. They are supposed to be these narrow ledges, ropes, ladders, and dank tunnels. It's basically the sort of urban landscape that only the Khajiit can effectively travel through. Now, what is really interesting is that the author notes that although traditionally it is considered a port, a major port in the Quinn Rao Legion of Elsweyr, that's not actually what it is. It doesn't live up to the reputation. The author suggests that, well, let me just read you the quote first. Quote, "Even in seas of their own design, the Khajiit are largely adverse to naval enterprises. Instead, traffic between Lesweyr and other provinces is primarily managed through the Nirn Strand terminus at the very tip of the peninsula. Though sugar fibril transport is an affordable and safe mode of transportation, non-Khajiiti incoming passengers are exceptionally scarce. A popular tall tale in countless skooma dens holds that the only sizable band of imperial visitors to the city was a delegation of diplomats in the early years of Septim's supreme reign. If this account holds even the smallest kernel of truth, It may well have been this event which provided Talos with the dangerous idea of recolonizing the Carmine Moon. End quote. So yeah, not only does moon sugar induce these sort of crazy trances that the first pocket guide described, it also apparently serves as a means of travel. There is something called the sugar fibril, which allows them to traverse great distances. So Senchal isn't really a port at all. That's a crazy type of revelation, isn't it? I'm just thinking of the gameplay implications of this if we were to have like a game set in Elsweyr. Like, would we snort sugar to fast travel? Like, this is just crazy. Honestly, I love the creativity of the second pocket guide. The next place we get to look at is Torval, another city. Now, the first pocket guide describes it as the home of the main, but here it's described even in grander terms, if it's even possible. The city apparently covers a huge crater lagoon, and the walls of the crater transition into the walls of the main's palace. The palace itself is described as saccharinite, which I think refers to saccharin, the artificial sweetener, so it's essentially also supposed to be made of sugar. Sugar is actually brought to the shore of the city, of the lagoon, in slow waves by the water. The main's palace itself is the home and workplace of many servants and courtiers. Actually, the author gives us quite a lot of details about the main. So first, this one, quote, "Central in the palace is the main's private residence, a secluded retreat where he may occasionally dock to shed into a more manageable mortal form and indulge in nourishment or companionship." End quote. Very interesting. I think to understand this a bit more, let's bring in the first pocket guide again. So the main is a unique Khajiit form. Khajiit come in 16, well actually more, different forms, but the main is unique. There is only one main, which is this special form and also serves as the spiritual leader of the species. In the first pocket guide, he is described in a relatively mundane, worldly way. Now, the second pocket guide tells us that traditionally, all Khajiit would shave off their manes to give to the leader, who would then bear the weight of all their manes. You can definitely see the symbolism of him bearing the burdens of his people or whatever, but I don't think it's supposed to be just symbolism in the case of the Khajiit, right? But then with the advance of time, as the number of Khajiit increased, particularly toward the late centuries of the potentates, it was simply impossible, for practical reasons, for the main to carry all those manes. However, we then learn that after the Khajiit had, quote, "scaled heaven," end quote, the problems cease to exist. So now the main carries all the mains again of apparently 200 million Khajiit. Okay, this is very much in line with what the chapter is telling us about the Khajiit climbing to Elsweyr. What's more interesting to me about this is the specific number, because Elder Scrolls lore usually avoids population numbers, right, for clear reasons. Mostly because the gameplay can never quite live up to those numbers, obviously. But 200 million Khajiit, that's really interesting. It's a good way to gauge the scope of Tamriel, right? Now, the physical description of the main is even more confusing. Quote, "In his commonest guise, the main is a siliceous sphere of vast dimensions, a third moon among the stars of his greater palace. The location of the satellite lord changes constantly, orbiting Elsweyr along a set but complex and indecipherable trajectory." End quote. By the way, siliceous means covered in hair, which, yeah, that makes sense. So this description of the main is almost ethereal, right? The main is a moon. Now, despite the main being the Khajiit leader, all Khajiit are free to visit them. There is no difference of rank, gender, or form, and there are always many visitors in the audience tower waiting for a glimpse of the main on the horizon. Okay, so in the first pocket guide, the main basically seemed to be like this guy carried around on his palanquin all day, right? I say guy, but honestly, I should probably use more neutral language like they, right? But anyway, this person just carried around on the palanquin all day. And here, the main is a freaking third moon of Tamriel, maybe not even Tamriel, question mark. I have no idea. This is so confusing. And what do the visitors do? Quote, "Many of these join the main on his journey for a while and watch as he shapes and reshapes the land. The interior is usually said to be ill-suited to a description in words and varies strongly between accounts. Some guests report a boundless swirl of hair waving leisurely in pink sucrose vapors like kelp in water. Others recall strange geographies, hallways, and inviting furnishing rooms, which they never managed to visit more than once. On the main's character, opinions are undivided. Wise beyond time, comforting, beautiful, and perfect in any way imaginable. End quote. So yeah, the main seems to be a literal person turned god. And to conclude this chapter, we also learn that an IGS representative has actually visited the main, and they had a sort of strange exchange which apparently lasted many hours, but after, the representative was unable to remember almost anything and has managed to reproduce only these words of the main. And listen carefully because this is going to be so confusing. There is no punctuation, this just free flow, okay? Quote, "Welcome. I am such a fine thread. You walk the Tibrals ripen early this year. Beware, they will not like the book. Hatta Sirod blood runs thin, so soon it will be a healthy boy. You know the number, Navarre. I am has your queen already given up on try to remember Null for a banner. She will always think of you, even now, everyone farewell." End quote. That's a funny word, everyone. And yeah, that was Elsweyr in the second pocket guide. Pretty cool, huh? A Million-Eyed Insect Dreaming. Morrowind. This chapter was written by Baruch for the second pocket guide, but was only published in August 2013, which I believe makes it the latest chapter to be released. It is written entirely in poetic paragraphs of about 150 words each or so. And you might be thinking, okay, what is this chapter's gimmick, right? Because we've seen Morrowind before, we've played Morrowind, we know what the province is like. How are they going to make this interesting? I think I will refrain from answering the question right now, and let's just dive straight into the text. So just to illustrate how it is written, I will read you the entire opening paragraph. Quote, "In Niben, the winds limit themselves to commonplace tricks, harassing the unfaithful and confusing travelers. But eastward, beyond the mountains of Shaden, the winds begin to change. In this land, they take on new shapes, becoming great black titans and hellions, ravaging the landscape and bringing constant horror crashing down upon the scarce settlements that barely cling to the damned canyons and mesas. Here, the fell winds of Morrow bellows out from the flame-frosted ravines of Balur the Red Mountain, carrying with them eternal and memorious ashes which roil from within. Stirred from their slumber by the crackling bolt of Lorcan, these ashes are saturated with the remains of these behemoths who resided there before the coming of the dragons and the lightning of the dawn. This strange hellscape is Veloth, the impenetrable valley of ash, which rages against the new lords of Mundus like a ruptured wound on the face of Tamriel." End quote. Well, I believe Balur, mentioned in the middle of this paragraph, is a reference to Bal-Ur, the shrine to Molag Bal, which can be found north of Suran. But the more interesting part of this is Prophet Veloth, and I'm saying it this way because there is actually an accent on the E. Honestly, I believe that this text's gimmick, or what makes it different from what we've already seen, is that it turns Morrowind into an almost Tolkien-esque high fantasy, something kind of like The Lord of the Rings, which I believe is a subversion of the alienness of Morrowind. You know, most of these chapters are trying to make what has been described in a more mundane way crazier, just more eccentric, and I believe that this chapter is doing kind of the opposite. At least that's the impression I first got from this, mostly because of those accents and on some established words, right? But there is more than that going on as well. Honestly, this whole chapter is just a really interesting take on the legends and myths of Morrowind. Quote, "In the early days of the Elven schisms, their prophet Veloth, who gives his name to the awful country, heard Boethiah's sermon uttered by the duplicitously doubled orifice of the famous liar king of Alinor, and was moved to heterodox exaltations, becoming known in those lands as Velos, evangelist to fools. For his heresy, the petty tyrants of the jungle estranged his mouth from his face by Kabbalistic rituals of blood and laceration. End quote. Well, it's clear that this is not a sympathetic description of the province, is it? The Liar King, I believe, refers to Trinimag here quite clearly. And yes, this is the legend of how Veloth came with his companions to Morrowind. We know that he went with his followers east, and the text then tells us that to this day his followers are nomads in the Ashlands. The author then switches gears to describe what the Dark Elves are actually like. He uses several adjectives here, like contemplative, taciturn, unfriendly, distrustful. They are described as having ancient laws and rigid hierarchy. The worst punishment for them is apparently exile because they view everything outside of their province as essentially worthless. Quote, though Veloth is part of the Empire, its people do not seem aware that any such empire exists or has dominion over them and their nations. Certainly they do not recognize it formally, as they have never uttered one word regarding it. End quote. But the author then goes on to say that this also means that they have never really rebelled, and the main thing that characterizes them is them simply minding their business, carving masks or shields out of chitin, and harvesting ash. I bet you weren't expecting ash harvesting to be a thing here, huh? But there is a whole paragraph dedicated to it. Listen. Quote, like the dust of moths, Velothi ash can induce visions when handled with appropriate care. Elven shamans apply a small blot of ash on one or both of their temples, which burns and blisters their scalp, but also grants them access to the numinous world of dreams and long-dead memories. The ash dreams can take many forms, sometimes creating kaleidoscopic apparitions before the waking eyes, sometimes plummeting the user into a hypnotic realm without right angles. The most intense users of the ash are the Mabrigash, elven women who have crafted an ash face, a mask which they wear as they dream, which is at all times, for the flesh has been seared from their skulls. The Mabrigash are consulted regularly by the wise among the elves, for the ash face speaks truths that no mortal could discern alone. Crucially, the ash has a mind of its own, and the shaman who uses it has no control over what will come to pass, which, as often as not, is the stuff of twisted nightmares. End quote. Some pretty creative stuff there, huh? To augment their visions, the elves apparently also use scarification and the rhythm of their drums. But their dreams are actually independent spirits of overturned kalpas, therefore not friendly to Mundus. However, there are supposedly these creatures called Nyx beasts, which can travel between waking and unwaking world, devouring ghosts and spirits. As for the Mabrigash, they need ancestral guides to escort them through the visions, and by doing this they gradually adopt the image of their ancestors. They also have to hunt and slaughter the Nyx hounds to defend their ancestors, although they are apparently able to also breed the Nyx hounds into mighty mounts. And notice that up until now the author has been speaking of the Ashlanders as representing what really is Morrowind, or Veloth, I guess, in this case. But now we also turn to the settled peoples. The text tells us that some elves have betrayed their ancestors, and they are described as the settled ones. Quote, insanely, they have chosen to forego nomadism and abandon the walking paths in a province incapable of sustaining agriculture. With the sole exception of the Dagoth Sharmat, they have fallen into the worship of the shapeshifter demon Almsivi. Once mortal, this hermaphroditous monster takes the form of 3 persons, each a caricature of one of the higher Daedra. The Almsivi first emerged as a dream-born doppelganger of Sul Alandro, the shield-bearer to the ancient Hortator Nerevar. End quote. What a wild way to describe the Almsivi, huh? Now, we know from established lore that Alandro Sul was actually the shield-bearer of Nerevar and is credited for spreading the belief that the tribunes murdered him. But the text adds even more details to his story. Apparently, Alandro saw the murder of Nerevar and had his thoughts blasted from his skull by Almsivy. Fortunately, the chain hood he wore, Wraith Mail, was later broken into individual ringlets, and today each Ashcan and Mabragash carry one or more of these ringlets as piercings so that they are able to hear his holy whispers. After this heinous act, the demon Almsivy then kidnapped Veloth, chaining him and stoking his doubts, which is obviously just a metaphorical way to describe their takeover of Morrowind. Veloth, being tormented by fear from Trinimach and false apparitions, ultimately could not withstand it, and his soul shattered. Quote, "The normally stoic and resolute prophet so convulsed with fury and anguish that he rent the flesh from his throat so that he could scream aloud. In this moment of weakness, Veloth was ensnared by the repulsive tendrils of Almsivy and taken to a dreamscape of malevolent demons that have not walked the earth in ages uncountable." End quote. Veloth was then apparently jailed in Lyrock, which, if you know your lessons of Vivek, is another name for Bardau, the Ministry of Truth. So once again, the text is kind of playing on this duality between the province of Morrowind or Resdain or Veloth here and the prophet Veloth himself, right? It's a really cool way to tell this story. Now, what is a bit confusing in this account is that Vivek is also described as, quote, "the greatest city of the House Elves," end quote, which, we know that there are greater cities on the mainland, but sure, I guess. But now the author brings up another relevant figure, the pious Mabragash Bar Zaya Sul, which I think is supposed to be a stand-in for Berenzia, right? The queen of Morrowind. Apparently she tried her utmost to free Veloth, struggling for centuries fruitlessly, but then Cyrodiil armies came, and what followed was this, quote, "The ash-face of Bar Zaya Sul has since spoken only of jumbled distressing woes, so what then occurred would be lost, were it not for the register of her Nyx companion, a million-eyed insect dreaming. Waiting for her at that trans-dimensional point," the Hound records, "was an apparition of the Emperor who greeted her despite her obvious protestation. With the uneasy approval of her ancestors, and consequently all the nomadic nations of the Nearer East, Bar Zaya Sul gave over Veloth to save Veloth, sacrificing history and honor for the one the Dark Elves loved more dearly than them both. With this sorry betrayal, Mundus moved in an unseemly manner. Lyrock was open to them, and Barzaya and her host stepped into the prison of the prophet to free him at last. But once beyond the gateway, they found only golden footprints, impossibly facing east, in a world without Orients, until at last they dissipated into images of chitin-clad Nyx mongrels." End quote. And that is also the conclusion of the Morrowind chapter. The Great Apes of the Grat, Valenwood. Unfortunately, Valenwood is another chapter which has never been written, and I will just read you the entire account of the Imperial Library. Quote, "Little was done on the Valenwood chapter, though the decision was made early to focus it on the Imga rather than the Bosmer, and to present it like the most natural thing in the world. Bosmeri landmarks, like Falinesti, were to be recontextualized to belong to the Imga. The art posted below was created by Lootmoth and was released at a later date." End quote. The Abiding Eye, Argonia. Unfortunately, this is yet another unreleased chapter, but one that we actually have a few passages from, which we are going to read. Now, the chapter as a whole was meant to focus on the Hist. The Hist is this network of sentient trees who the Argonians seem to have a connection with, a religious type of connection. And obviously this focus on the Hist was yet another attempt by the authors to distance themselves from already established lore, to present something new. The question then became how to even present the Hist. The Imperial Library tells us this, quote, "The dominant thread of thought was that there were to be refugees from another Kalpa/dimension/dragon who broke up their titanic souls and/or memories and stored them inside lizards and human simulacra, the Cathringi. End quote. So the Cathringi, the pretty famous silver-skinned race, which seemed to have been native to Argonia, was actually, according to this, a product of the Hist, a creation of the Hist, if you will. But this was just one idea for the chapter. Another strategy was proposed by Baruch, and we actually have some later drafts written by this member of the Temple Zero Society. In this portrayal of the province, Baruch focuses more on Tiber Septim's expeditions into the marsh, and years later he summed up his version of the chapter like this, quote, Tiber Septim and a party of explorers, including his lieutenant and his lieutenant's small son, who are from the line of Culhwch, march into the impenetrable, unexplored Black Marsh to find the Hist and treat with the trees. As the years go by, the lizards and their masters always seemingly just out of reach, the party dies off one by one in the swamp. They give up for a time and spend decades in an idyllic little valley with the Cothri, where the lieutenant's son marries and has a son of his own. Eventually, everyone is dead but Tiber and the lieutenant's grandson, and they are lost, alone, in the wilderness. Tiber is 100 years old, feeble and dying, and the grandson has to carry him. They stumble upon the nest of none other than Gru Bula Gru, who tells them they will never find the Hist and some wise shit, and then disappears, and they find themselves less than an hour from the edge of the marsh and Cyrodiil, where it has been only an arbitrarily short amount of time since they entered the swamp. End quote. Before you ask, no, I have no idea what Gru Bula Gru is a reference to. But yeah, this proposal would have emphasized the unexplorability and again, unfathomability of the province of Black Marsh to the humans. There was also a discussion about the Cathringi silver skin, namely whether they were born this way, or if they painted their skin to be silver, or if their skin had never really been silver and this is just some faulty archaeological source giving us false information. And this is actually the topic of the only piece of text that we have from the chapter. It was supposed to be a sidebar section of the chapter, and it was written by Lady Nerevar, so let's go into it. The author begins by explaining that folk tales have always depicted Cathringi as a silver-skinned race. But a certain archaeologist, someone named Augustus Blongion, was the first to attempt to systematize this theory, to give it a firm shape, as the guide puts it. This was in the year 865 of the Second Era, by the way. So this archaeologist discovered a mass grave with glistering mummies, and he touted this as irrefutable proof that the Cathringi were silver-skinned. He then started crafting all sorts of mythical tales to explain this. His tales talk about the Cathringi being peaceful, educated theologians, and all of this is basically just conjecture based on this one archaeological discovery. The text then reveals that the silver skin of the glistering mummies was actually caused by the mineral content of the watery ground, and all of Augustus's explanations are just nonsense that he made up, which is why today his work is completely discredited. But the author then asks, why did the myths about the Cathringi being silver-skinned start in the first place, even before Augustus's discovery? Well, Cothri silver artifacts have been discovered throughout history, artifacts such as armor, and it could be that certain historians mistook them for their actual skin, the actual skin of the mummies that they discovered, or it could be caused by a mistranslation of a word describing the moon, because the word for moon actually had a sort of holy connotation and could easily be mistranslated as silver. This idea is also supported by the fact that many Cathringi embraced the doctrine of the Alessian order, so maybe this is supposed to tell us more about their piety rather than their physical appearance. And that's the end of the sidebar, which, as far as the Imperial Library is concerned, is the only actual text that would have made it into the final version of the Argonia chapter. The Threat of Mirrors, Aelinor and the Summering Isles. Unfortunately, once again, nothing was ever written of this chapter. This is becoming a bit of a recurring theme toward the end of the second pocket guide, isn't it? Regardless, let's talk about it because it would definitely have been very interesting. So, the Imperial Library tells us, for example, about Michael Kirkbride's proposed etymology for the name of the Summerset Isles. He wanted this to be derived from the phrase, the sum is set, which sounds kind of related to the concept of zero summing and other cosmic stuff that Michael Kirkbride has written about. To be honest, I'm not really familiar with all the ways that sums and summing are a thing in Elder Scrolls lore, so I'm not really sure where exactly he was going with this proposal. But anyway, it was rejected, or at least disputed, by some of the other writers. What the Imperial Library actually focuses on are the ideas of Adonorsil, which were posted all the way in late 2021, meaning almost a decade after the guide was being written. Let me just read to you what Adonorsil wrote so there is no room for misinterpretation. Quote, "The whole thing was a comment on the idea that you can never translate the true Tamriel into something game consumable without severely diminishing it. As usual, it's a sharp contrast to all previous information. The conceit would have been that an IGS associate received an exceedingly rare invitation to visit the Altmer homeland. As they first catch sight of Crystal Tower, it is splendorous, unlike anything else, but ultimately somehow still plausible? The travelogue continues and turns out to be something of a letdown. Summerset really is just a bunch of ruins inhabited by a handful of haggard, real Altmer, perhaps as few as 8, with all the rest just being mirrors, reflections, refracted, recombined. Look what you have done to us, say the Altmer. The gravest crime perpetrated against the Altmer is that the Empire, creation, us, observed them, put number, name, and shape to them, killed them by forcing them into the imaginable. You're doing it right now, you sick fuck." End quote. This whole idea is absolutely wild, and it just instantly makes me think of the Altmer section of the first Pocket Guide, where we learn about how the Altmer use numbers instead of names. And well, obviously, if we take into account this new information, it seems like the numbers directly reflect which of the Altmer individuals, specimen, are reflections of the real, actual, existent Altmer. I'm not explaining this very well, am I? It also goes back to the title of the chapter, the threat of mirrors, right? The idea of mirroring, of the real Altmer mirroring themselves so as to create the illusion, or maybe not even an illusion, of just there being many more Altmer than there actually are. Regardless, amazing stuff. Those regions largely unwritten. This is the final chapter of the second Pocket Guide, but it is actually divided into several different regions, ones which we've never seen before or heard anything about, and you will quickly understand why. So first, some meta information as always. This was basically meant to be a hodgepodge of crazy chapters, the sort of chapters which were meant to be jokes or gags in a sense, or just something completely out of the left field, even for this crazy lore book. Now, there are many more of these planned but unreleased. For example, Battlespire was supposed to get its own sub-chapter here, Pyandonia, Roscrea, and the Window-Shoaled Kingdom of Beetles, which I have no idea what that could be. But ultimately, we only have 3 different sections here, all of which were written by Michael Kirkbride, of course. Explaining the chapter, Kirkbride had this to say, quote, "Regions is my favorite right now. It's the release valve of idiotic ideas high and low. It has no limitations except for the difficulty of trying to not make these places islands all the time. I understand the difficulty, as regions set inside the provinces feel like they would be better served as places of interest, but still, everything I've written for it so far has been a joke of some kind or another, but I'm fine with that." End quote. Better is a better word. The Linpen March. So, in case you're not familiar, the Linpen or Linpar March is a region depicted all the way in the Elder Scrolls Arena, which I haven't played, and I've never really heard of this region before. Regardless, it's somewhere in Valenwood. The chapter opens by establishing that this region was displaced from the land of the great apes by the Empress Morehatha, and gives a pretty fascinating and ridiculous account of how exactly this happened. So let's follow the Empress on her adventure, and by the way, here I'll be quoting a lot because you just gotta hear this for yourselves. Quote, while falconeering in the deeps of Valenwood atop her equine brother, and with a train of tree mimes and vat-grown dwarf-sized versions of other favorite relatives behind her, the hoary monstrosity called King Dead Wolf Deer attacked. Perhaps attacked is the wrong word, sought to rejoin them thinking they were all a vision of his ages ago wild hunt. In any case, the monster's display of brotherhood was frighteningly loud and led to some casualties, including the court's royal vine mime, Magpie O'Middlepants, who was trampled to death by the spooked Uriel VI, an uncounted number of Uncleculi, and Her Majesty's favorite falcon, Crow. I guess this chapter is, again, playing on the joke of people's relatives being whatever the hell Michael Kirkbride wants them to be, just like he did in the Skyrim chapter all the way at the beginning. So yeah, the Empress is riding her brother as a horse into the woods. Yes, that's a thing. There's a bunch of weird characters like this vine mime, whatever that means, Magpie O'Middlepants, and there's a falcon named Crow. Okay, well, regardless, King Dead Wolf Deer, of all things mentioned here, is actually something that's been established before. This is not something Michael Kirkbride just made up on the spot. It's mentioned and depicted in the first pocket guide, and it's supposed to be a Bosmer transformed into a monster by the Wild Hunt. The text then proceeds to explain that the Bosmer didn't try to kill King Dead Wolf Deer because they were apparently not hungry and also just not willing to eat who was basically their relative. So instead of using lethal arrows, they used tiny arrows to just annoy him a bit. But the resulting commotion brought out the great apes. Quote, at the end, the spirit of Crow the Falcon was sent up and out at the Empress's order to summon Kinnereth's reigns. Morehatha, at this point, was picking out robin bones from her velvets and tossing away her Imga-leavings-laden wig, all while keeping her brother from galloping out from under her, yelling obscenities that King Dead Wolf Deer had not heard since old Borges's time. The Maiden of Rains sent a torrential downpour at the Imperial Order. The Linpen March was washed away entirely, sliding to whereabouts unknown. Hopefully, the Elder Lord of Teeth and 20 Antlers will trouble us no more, as there were no recorded survivors. End quote. And the text concludes, yes, we're already at the end, the text concludes that the Empress and her brother arrived to Cyrodiil through a small wind shift magic, and the end goes like this, quote, as for Crow the Falcon, his sacrifice at Linpen March was made manifest in Cothringilet metals, and his aspect watches over a row of hedgeheads of Green Emperor Road, giving much pride to those living birds that allow their regal ghosts to parrot some manner of speech. End quote. Well, I love the callback to Green Emperor Road from the Cyrodiil section of the first pocket guide, and I'm afraid the rest just kind of goes over my head, including Michael Kirkbride's sense of humor. Moving on to the second region. Lenecolonel, the Anachronile. Listen, I have no idea how to pronounce that word. I gave it my best efforts, okay? The name of the region is spelled with like 3 different accents, okay? And as for the Anachronile, that's just, a cross between anachronistic and isle, as in island. So yeah, that's Anachronile, in case you're just listening to this video and not looking at the name that I'm showing on the screen. So Lenecolonel is supposed to be the southernmost island of Cathnoquey, and the name actually has a meaning. Lennoc is supposed to mean south, but we mean west, in Quey. What makes this island worthy of being included in this chapter is what happened after the Akaviri surrender to Riemann Cyrodiil. When Riemann beat the Akaviri invaders, the island of Lenecolonel was actually annexed by the Empire to help capture Zishi military leaders, which were supposedly hoping to escape through this isle, although not really. Quote, when no such nets bore fruit, perhaps since the Zishi indeed never invaded by sea and therefore did not use it for retreat, The Imperial Draco-Cryptography and Authentications Congress petitioned to the Elder Council that the native government be further reorganized to alleviate the sleeve strain of invaluable but atrophying memospores. Seeing no need for extended deliberations, Linux's original inhabitants were almost immediately moth-altered by decree to serve as a collective repository for the most ancient dream drafts that had not been converted to Silk either due to negligence or whim or both. End quote. Yeah, so to simplify, the Empire basically genetically or I guess magically altered the local population, converting them into a strange hybrid species. The text goes on to explain that the Mothmen actually began to breed in what is described as a strange, unnatural way, and eventually they became quite numerous and quite powerful. They even tried to seize the mission house of the IDA, the Imperial Draco-Cryptography and Authentications Congress, which was basically overseeing the island at this point. The only thing preventing these Mothmen from succeeding were their mutual quarrels. They just couldn't really get agreed on what was to be done. So yeah, east of Tamriel there is just this crazy island controlled by these weird Empire-created creatures. The text concludes with this paragraph, quote, "The Empire has never relinquished its holdings on the Anachronile. It was eventually renamed Lenaculinel after subsequent failed sieges by the Mothmen, a small palindrome transloop magic that surprisingly rendered the island both inescapable by its prisoners and yet safe for officially sanctioned visitors bearing a proper set of phrenolocles." End quote. I love how this comes back to the idea of the power of names on Tamriel. The simple act of renaming this island seems to have imprisoned the Mothmen on it, so they can't actually, spread out and invade the rest of Tamriel. Or can they? I'm sure they could find a way. Let's move on to the last region. The Republic of Hard. Hard is spelled H-A-H-D, by the way. It's supposedly an underwater country that never interferes with anything on Tamriel, which is why nobody has ever really talked about it anywhere. The government of Hard is not recognized by the Empire at all. They just don't care. Geographically, it's supposed to be located in High Rock, under the Delacey Isles. And yes, under, because, as I said, it's an underwater country. The only reason why we know about Hard is because of a certain mapmaker, and because of that one time that it actually impacted Tamriel somewhat. Quote, "In the early Third Era, the Altmeri keepers of the Orrery of First Hold suddenly paid tariffs to the Empire on behalf of the Republic of Hard for submersible exports of mnemolycite to the Emirates of Nard. While the Septim regime was glad to receive the non-untrivial amount of the tariff expense, it did demand to know three things. 1. What and where was Hard? 2. What exactly was mnemolycite? And 3. What and where was Nard?" End quote. I gotta say, this is a brilliant premise for a chapter, isn't it? So the Empire asked the Altmer these questions, but they didn't really get any answers, and what they decided to do then seems pretty radical. I guess they were suspecting the Altmer of something really devious, because they just sent their armada to the Summerset Isles, to Alinor. Now, Alinor responded by sending their sunbirds to meet the army, so there was basically this giant battle about to happen, and it didn't happen only because at the last moment, an undisclosed courier brought a book from Hard which was supposed to explain everything and end the hostilities. So Altmer and Cyrodiil scholars got together to study the book, watched over by an impartial Psijic from the recently reappeared island of Artaeum, and so they studied the book to understand what was going on. Ultimately, their conclusion was that everything described in the book is impossible. The habitat described there just could never exist. And later, they even got some additional information from civilized dregs living close to Hard, close to the place where Hard supposedly was, because the dregs told the Empire and the Altmer that they didn't know what Hard was, and the book is just all lies. Of course, the investigators were not focused only on Hard. Quote, on the separate cases of the Emirates of Nod and the mineral called mnemolycite, the Republic's explanations for both were the same. They were figments of imagination, a kingdom and a treasure made popular in the Republic by their recurrence in its many fables, underwater campfire stories, and stage plays. We are not a very creative folk, the Hard admitted, but we always enjoy hearing about the fantastical heroes of Sandy Nod and the wondrous powers of mnemolycite because of the delight that their impossibilities bring to our hearts. End quote. So yeah, all of this seems to be just a made-up story. There have never been any Emirates of Nod nor mnemolycite. But the question remains, why did First Hold pay the Empire in the first place? The book, which was promising to answer these questions, actually did not answer this particular one. And so the scholars, the joint committees of Altmer and Imperials, spent the next 50 years studying this book. After those 50 years, they came to the brilliant idea of checking the financial logs of First Hold and the Imperial Treasury to actually see what was going on. And this took them another 50 years. Though it seems that checking the financial logs was a bit above their pay grade because they just couldn't really do it, and eventually they decided to stop. This was in the year 230 of the Third Era. Coincidentally, or maybe not, later that same year, the island of Artaeum disappeared again. Okay, this is just the Psijics doing their thing, right? This is what they do. They appear and disappear. But then, days later, after this disappearance, some sailors traveling close to Iliac fished out a book titled The Dervish of Delesia and the Mnemolycite Maid. Now, fortunately, one of those sailors, the captain in fact, was related to one of the investigators, so he had an idea of what mnemolycite or Had or Nod was even supposed to be, and that's why he decided to read this book. Quote, Captain Eel began to read the manuscript immediately, if only out of a blood guilt to restore the unsatisfied honor of his ancestor. He was only a few paragraphs in when he realized to his astonishment the book's true nature. It was not, as its title might suggest, a fable about Nod from the denizens of Had, but rather a fable about Had from some unknown writer of Nod. The eponymous dervish was some kind of air-breathing sea soldier formerly of the Republican Guard, who was either protecting or wooing that maiden to first hold the star minerals of heaven. Perhaps most troubling was the author, a humble Nod of Nod, and his nearly rote-written preface, which clearly, if uncreatively, indicated that the book was part of a large series, or maybe even a shared universe, whose twin anchor points were always the same, an obsession with Had and the powers of mnemolycite. The latter was never adequately explained in the manuscript, nor has it ever been. End quote. So, Nod is not a fiction invented by Had. It's actually the other way around, according to this book. This is where the chapter abruptly ends with the author saying that, Had didn't even really deserve to be included in the second pocket guide. They just decided to write this section out of respect for their friend who had spent some time studying this region. And that, my friends, is the end of the second pocket guide. Once again, this one ends so abruptly. At the beginning, you get all these introductions and stuff like that, and there is no outro at the end. It just ends with the last section. So, yeah. If you listened this far, I congratulate you, because this was not an easy one to cover, and definitely not an easy one for you to listen to, I imagine. The guide is very fun to read, but it is a very particular read, I would say. I would still highly encourage you to do it. But as you've heard, it does not give a lot of factual information deliberately. It's not designed to be that. It also just assumes you know a lot. Now, I try to help you understand, but frankly, First of all, there are many things here that I don't understand. Second of all, I went really quickly over some things which could have used much more of an explanation, and even then, you can see the episode has ended up being 3 hours long. So I hope you enjoyed this anyway. I hope this motivates you to read the actual book for yourself. And I promise that the next time we'll read something lighter, although somewhere down the line, I also hope to cover the third pocket guide to the Empire. Again, thank you for listening. I have been Savley, and I'll see you in another podcast. I'm Civi Bliss.